Case 1. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen seemed unremarkable, quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of nurse who blended into the background of hospital corridors during late-night shifts. He moved through intensive care units and cardiac wards with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, administering medications, offering comfort to patients in their most vulnerable moments. No one imagined he would become responsible for what investigators believe could be the largest serial killing spree by a health care worker in American history. Cullen began his nursing career in 1987 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. He was 27 years old, recently graduated from nursing school, and carried with him a history that should have raised immediate concerns. He had attempted suicide multiple times throughout his life, struggled with severe depression, and displayed patterns of instability that would follow him for decades. But psychiatric evaluations were not standard for nursing positions, and his credentials appeared solid. He was hired, given access to vulnerable patients, and assigned to night shifts where supervision was minimal. The deaths began almost immediately. Patients under Cullen's care experienced unexpected cardiac arrests, sudden drops in blood sugar, mysterious complications that couldn't be explained by their underlying conditions. A contamination incident at St. Barnabas in 1988 raised suspicions, and colleagues began noticing a pattern. When Cullen worked, people died. But no formal investigation was launched. Instead, when questions became too uncomfortable, Cullen simply resigned in 1992. The hospital let him walk away quietly, providing no warning to his next employer. This became the template for the next decade. Cullen moved from hospital to hospital across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, leaving a trail of unexplained deaths behind him. He worked at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, where a judge later died under suspicious circumstances. He moved to Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, where elderly patients coded during his shifts with alarming frequency. Each time concerns arose, each time colleagues whispered about unusual patterns, the response remained the same. Cullen would resign or be quietly dismissed, and the institutions would let him disappear rather than risk the liability and reputation damage of a formal investigation. At Morristown Memorial Hospital, Cullen's methods became clear to investigators years later. He accessed the medication dispensing system during night shifts, withdrawing drugs he had no authorization to handle. Digoxin, a heart medication that becomes lethal in high doses. Insulin, which could send non-diabetic patients into fatal hypoglycemic shock. Epinephrine, which could trigger cardiac arrest in patients with certain conditions. He carried these medications in his pockets, entered patient rooms when families had gone home for the night, and injected them directly into IV lines. The drugs worked quickly. Patients would code within minutes or hours, and by the time medical teams responded, the substances had dispersed through their systems, difficult to detect in routine toxicology screens. The death toll mounted across hospitals in Phillipsburg, Flemington, Easton, Liberty, Bethlehem, and Allentown. Cullen worked at 9 different facilities over 16 years, and at each one, mortality rates spiked during his shifts. Families grieved loved ones who had been expected to recover. A man who survived heart surgery only to die days later from an unexplained cardiac event. An elderly woman admitted for a routine procedure who never regained consciousness. A middle-aged patient recovering from a minor illness who suddenly crashed. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern that spanned more than a decade and crossed state lines, yet no coordinated investigation connected the dots. The pattern finally drew serious attention at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, where Cullen worked from 2002 to 2003. A series of deaths in the coronary care unit prompted hospital officials to review medication records. They discovered that large quantities of drugs had been accessed without proper documentation, and the access logs pointed directly to Cullen. This time, rather than allowing him to quietly resign, the hospital contacted law enforcement. Detectives began pulling records from Somerset Medical Center and quickly realized they were looking at something unprecedented. The number of deaths associated with Cullen's shifts was statistically impossible to explain through natural causes or coincidence. They expanded their investigation to his previous employers, requesting patient records and medication logs. What emerged was a horrifying timeline spanning 16 years, 9 hospitals, and potentially hundreds of victims. When investigators confronted Cullen in December 2003, he initially denied everything. But as evidence mounted and detectives pressed him with specific cases, his resistance crumbled. He began confessing, though even in confession, his answers remained frustratingly incomplete. He admitted to killing patients, but claimed he couldn't remember all of them. He said he wanted to end their suffering, that he believed he was acting mercifully, but investigators found no evidence that the patients he murdered were terminal or in unbearable pain. Many were expected to recover fully. Cullen ultimately confessed to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders, but investigators believe the true number is far higher. Some estimates place his victim count between 300 and 400, which would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. He worked approximately 6,000 shifts across those 16 years. Hospital officials reviewing mortality data found that death rates at multiple facilities dropped dramatically after his departure, in some cases by more than 50%. The statistical correlation was undeniable. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Cullen agreed to cooperate. Prosecutors in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania charged him with multiple counts of murder. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to killing 13 patients in New Jersey and 1 in Pennsylvania. In 2006, he pleaded guilty to 3 additional murders in New Jersey. Rather than face trial, he accepted plea agreements that resulted in 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. In exchange for these guilty pleas, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, and Cullen agreed to cooperate with investigators trying to identify additional victims. That cooperation proved limited. Cullen provided names and details about some cases, but his memory seemed selective and incomplete. Families desperate for answers about their loved ones' deaths attended hearings where he testified, hoping to learn whether their father, mother, or spouse had been among his victims. Often, Cullen couldn't or wouldn't provide clear answers. He claimed he didn't remember specific patients, that everything blurred together after so many years. For many families, there would never be certainty, never confirmation that their suspicions about an unexpected death were justified. The investigation into how Cullen operated for so long without being stopped revealed systemic failures at every level. 9 hospitals had either suspected him or directly witnessed warning signs, yet not one reported him to law enforcement or licensing authorities. When Cullen resigned from positions, hospitals provided neutral references or simply confirmed his employment dates, giving his next employer no indication that concerns existed. This pattern of institutional self-protection over patient safety allowed a serial killer to move freely through the healthcare system for more than a decade. Hospital administrators defended their decisions by citing liability concerns and the difficulty of proving wrongdoing without concrete evidence. But internal documents showed that some facilities conducted investigations that strongly suggested Cullen was responsible for patient deaths. They simply chose not to act on their own findings. The motivation was clear. A public accusation without a conviction would expose the hospital to defamation lawsuits and reputation damage. Letting a problematic employee resign quietly protected the institution, even if it endangered patients elsewhere. The fallout extended far beyond criminal proceedings. Families of Cullen's victims filed civil lawsuits against multiple hospitals, arguing that the institutions had been negligent in their hiring, supervision, and reporting practices. Many of these cases settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The publicity surrounding the case forced uncomfortable conversations about how hospitals handle employees suspected of harming patients and what responsibility healthcare institutions have to warn others about potentially dangerous staff. The Cullen case directly influenced legislation in multiple states. New Jersey passed a law requiring healthcare facilities to report suspicious employee behavior to authorities and to provide complete employment histories when giving references. The bill, championed by families of Cullen's victims, aimed to prevent hospitals from passing dangerous employees to unsuspecting facilities. Similar legislation emerged in other states, creating databases where healthcare employers could report concerns about staff members and check the records of potential hires. Professional licensing boards also implemented reforms. Nursing organizations developed stricter protocols for monitoring practitioners with patterns of patient deaths during their shifts. Hospitals adopted statistical monitoring systems designed to flag unusual mortality rates associated with specific employees. These changes came too late for Cullen's victims, but represented an acknowledgement that the system had failed catastrophically. Cullen himself provided few insights into his motivations. In interviews with investigators and mental health professionals, he claimed he killed patients to relieve their suffering, but this explanation didn't align with the facts. Many of his victims were not terminally ill. Some were recovering well and expected to be discharged soon. His selection of victims appeared random, driven more by opportunity and access than by any assessment of their medical condition or quality of life. Mental health experts who evaluated him noted his history of depression and suicide attempts, but found no clear psychiatric diagnosis that explained his actions. He understood that what he was doing was wrong, yet he continued for 16 years. The cultural impact of the Cullen case extended into popular media. Netflix released a documentary about his crimes, and in 2022, the film The Good Nurse dramatized the investigation that finally brought him to justice, focusing on the role of Amy Loughran, a fellow nurse at Somerset Medical Center who cooperated with detectives to gather evidence against him. The film emphasized the courage required to blow the whistle on a colleague and the institutional resistance that whistleblowers often face. Cullen remains imprisoned at New Jersey State Prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. He is now 64 years old and has shown no interest in appealing his convictions or seeking any form of early release. In the rare interviews he has given from prison, he continues to offer vague explanations about mercy and suffering, never fully accounting for why he chose to kill or why he targeted patients who were not dying. For the families of his confirmed victims and the hundreds of families who suspect but cannot prove their loved ones were murdered, his silence offers no comfort. The memory of Charles Cullen continues to influence discussions about patient safety, institutional accountability, and the systems designed to protect vulnerable people in medical settings. His case exposed how easily someone with malicious intent could exploit the trust placed in healthcare workers, and how institutions prioritize their own interests over the obligation to protect patients. The reforms that emerged were necessary, but they came at a cost measured in hundreds of lives lost and families left searching for answers they would never fully receive. Case 2. Janine Jones. She was the nurse who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. When a child stopped breathing, Janine Jones was there, pushing the crash cart, calling for backup, performing chest compressions with urgent precision. When an infant's heart suddenly stopped, she was already moving, inserting IV lines, administering emergency medications, shouting instructions to stunned colleagues. She saved lives, or so it appeared. Parents whose children survived these terrifying episodes remembered her as the nurse who wouldn't give up, who fought for their babies when death seemed certain. No one realized she was creating the emergencies she claimed to be solving. Janine Jones began working as a licensed vocational nurse at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio in 1977. She was 27 years old, a mother herself, and possessed a forceful personality that dominated the pediatric intensive care unit where she was assigned. From the beginning, colleagues noticed something unsettling about her approach to nursing. She seemed drawn to crisis situations, almost excited when children coded. During emergency responses, she took charge with an intensity that felt disproportionate, barking orders at more experienced nurses and sometimes physically pushing others aside to be the one performing critical interventions. By 1981, patterns began emerging that no one could ignore. The pediatric ICU experienced an unusual surge in emergencies, particularly during evening and night shifts when Jones worked. Infants who had been stable suddenly crashed. Toddlers recovering from routine procedures went into cardiac arrest without warning. The death rate spiked so dramatically that nurses working alongside Jones began referring to her shifts as the death shift. The nickname wasn't meant as dark humor. It reflected genuine fear and confusion about why so many children were dying when Jones was on duty. Hospital staff started tracking the numbers informally, comparing mortality rates across different shifts and different nurses. The correlation was impossible to miss. When Jones worked, children died or experienced life-threatening emergencies at a rate far exceeding normal ICU statistics. During her shifts, emergency codes were called with alarming frequency. Yet Jones herself seemed to thrive in these moments of chaos, often successfully resuscitating the children and then basking in the gratitude of relieved parents and the recognition of administrators who saw her as a dedicated nurse willing to work the hardest cases. The methods Jones used became clear only after careful investigation. She accessed medications she had no authorization to handle, particularly muscle relaxants like succinylcholine and blood thinners like heparin. She carried these drugs in her pockets or concealed them in her workstation, then injected them into children's IV lines when no one was watching. Succinylcholine paralyzed the respiratory muscles, causing children to stop breathing. Heparin prevented blood clotting, leading to hemorrhages and shock. Both drugs could trigger cardiac arrest in infants and toddlers whose systems couldn't tolerate the sudden physiological disruption. What made Jones's actions particularly disturbing was the pattern that followed each attack. She would inject the child, step away briefly, then return moments later as the child began to crash. She would sound the alarm, call for the emergency team, and position herself at the center of the response. Sometimes she succeeded in reviving the child, allowing her to play the hero. Other times, despite aggressive intervention, the child died. Either outcome served her psychological needs. Successful resuscitations brought praise and attention. Deaths positioned her as the tireless nurse who fought valiantly but couldn't overcome impossible odds. Hospital administrators at Bexar County became increasingly concerned about the mortality statistics. An internal review confirmed that death rates in the pediatric ICU were unacceptably high and that most incidents occurred during Jones's shifts. But proving wrongdoing was complicated. Jones had explanations for every emergency, medical justifications for why certain children were more fragile than others, reasons why cardiac arrests happened despite appropriate care. She accused colleagues of incompetence when questions arose, claiming that she was being blamed for the failures of others. The hospital faced a difficult decision: fire a nurse based on suspicion and statistical correlation, or wait for concrete evidence that might never materialize. In March 1982, Bexar County Hospital made a choice that prioritized avoiding liability over preventing future harm. Rather than reporting Jones to law enforcement or state licensing authorities, administrators allowed her to resign. Hospital officials later claimed they lacked sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges and feared a wrongful termination lawsuit if they fired her without proof. So Jones walked away with a neutral employment record, free to seek work elsewhere. She found a position almost immediately at a private pediatric clinic in Kerrville, a small city about 65 miles northwest of San Antonio. Dr. Kathleen Holland had recently opened her pediatric clinic in Kerrville and needed a nurse with ICU experience. Jones's credentials seemed solid, and Bexar County Hospital provided no warning about the suspicions that had surrounded her departure. Dr. Holland hired her, and Jones began working at the clinic in August 1982. Within weeks, the pattern resumed with terrifying consistency. Children arriving at the clinic for routine checkups or minor illnesses suddenly experienced medical emergencies. A 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan was brought in for a routine immunization on September 17, 1982. She was healthy, meeting all her developmental milestones, and the visit should have been unremarkable. But shortly after Jones administered the injection, Chelsea stopped breathing. Emergency personnel rushed her to a hospital in San Antonio, where she died the following day. The official cause of death was listed as a seizure disorder, but Chelsea had no history of seizures, and no medical condition that would explain sudden cardiac and respiratory failure. Less than a month later, on September 23rd, another child at Dr. Holland's clinic experienced a life-threatening emergency while under Jones's care. Rolando Santos, a 4-week-old infant, was brought in for a routine checkup. During the appointment with Jones in the room, Rolando suddenly stopped breathing. Jones sprang into action, performing resuscitation while calling for emergency transport. The infant survived but suffered severe brain damage from oxygen deprivation. His parents couldn't understand what had happened. Their son had been perfectly healthy when they arrived at the clinic. The cluster of emergencies at Dr. Holland's clinic drew immediate attention. The facility had been open less than 2 months, yet multiple children had experienced cardiac and respiratory arrests during routine visits. Parents began sharing their experiences and noticed a common factor. Janine Jones had been present during every emergency. Dr. Holland reviewed her medical records and made a disturbing discovery. She found evidence that Jones had been accessing medications without authorization and that Jones had been alone with children just before they crashed. Dr. Holland contacted law enforcement, and investigators began examining the cases at both the Kerrville Clinic and Bexar County Hospital. They discovered patterns that pointed unmistakably toward Jones. Hospital pharmacy records showed that Jones had accessed unusual quantities of succinylcholine and heparin. Bottles of these medications were found missing or partially empty after her shifts. Witnesses reported seeing Jones carrying syringes in her pockets, a violation of standard protocols. Most damning, the statistical correlation was overwhelming. When Jones worked, children died or nearly died. When she didn't work, emergency rates returned to normal levels. Prosecutors faced a challenge in building criminal cases. Many of Jones's suspected victims had been cremated or buried years earlier, making it impossible to perform autopsies that might detect the drugs she used. Succinylcholine breaks down rapidly in the body, becoming nearly undetectable within hours. The passage of time and the absence of physical evidence meant that investigators could only pursue charges in cases where tissue samples had been preserved or where the timeline of events created clear proof of criminal action. In February 1984, Jones was charged with murder in the death of Chelsea McClellan and with injury to a child in the case of Rolando Santos. The trial focused heavily on statistical evidence and expert testimony about the improbability of so many emergencies occurring by chance. Prosecutors presented evidence that Jones had accessed medications she wasn't authorized to handle and that children consistently crashed when she was alone with them. The defense argued that Jones was being scapegoated for natural deaths and medical complications that no one could have prevented. The jury convicted Jones on both counts. In March 1984, she was sentenced to 99 years in prison for Chelsea McClellan's murder, and 60 years for injuring Rolando Santos, the sentences to run consecutively. Given the severity of the crimes and the suspected number of additional victims, the outcome seemed just. Jones would spend the rest of her life in prison, or so everyone assumed. What no one anticipated was a quirk in Texas law regarding prison overcrowding. In the 1970s and 1980s, Texas faced severe overcrowding in its prison system, leading to federal court intervention. As part of the solution, the state passed mandatory release laws that awarded prisoners extra time credit for good behavior and participation in prison programs. These laws were designed to manage prison populations but had unintended consequences for violent offenders serving long sentences. Under these provisions, Jones accumulated so much good time credit that her 159-year sentence would be satisfied after approximately 33 years. Despite being convicted of murder and suspected of dozens more killings, she was scheduled for mandatory release in 2018. As that date approached, public outrage intensified. Families of suspected victims, prosecutors who had worked her original case, and victim advocates lobbied desperately to prevent her release. They argued that Jones remained dangerous and that her crimes warranted life imprisonment without possibility of parole. District attorneys in Bexar County took action. They launched a renewed investigation into the deaths that occurred at Bexar County Hospital during Jones's employment there. Advances in forensic science and access to previously unavailable medical records allowed investigators to build new cases. On May 25, 2017, just months before her scheduled release, Jones was indicted for 5 additional murders that occurred between 1981 and 1982. Prosecutors filed murder charges in the deaths of infants who had died under suspicious circumstances during her shifts at the hospital. Jones was released from prison on May 25, 2018, after serving 33 years, but her freedom lasted only hours. She was immediately arrested on the new indictment and returned to custody. In a subsequent hearing, prosecutors presented evidence linking Jones to the deaths of these children, including medical records showing unexplained bleeding, respiratory failure, and cardiac arrests consistent with drug-induced emergencies. In October 2017, Jones pleaded guilty to killing 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer with an injection of an anti-seizure drug. The plea agreement resulted in a life sentence without possibility of parole. Investigators believe the true number of Jones's victims may never be fully known. Some estimates suggest she killed as many as 60 children during her time at Bexar County Hospital and the Kerrville Clinic. Many cases cannot be prosecuted because bodies were cremated, medical records were destroyed, or too much time has passed to gather reliable evidence. Families who lost children during the early 1980s and who had Jones as their nurse have lived with uncertainty for decades, suspecting but never confirming that their babies were murdered. The psychological profile that emerged from Jones's case became a textbook example of healthcare serial killers motivated by hero syndrome. She craved attention and validation, particularly in high-stress situations where she could demonstrate competence and garner praise. By creating emergencies, she manufactured opportunities to be seen as indispensable, skilled, and heroic. The suffering of the children and the trauma inflicted on their families were irrelevant to her. They existed as props in a performance where she played the starring role. The fallout from the Jones case forced hospitals across the country to examine their practices for detecting unusual patterns in patient outcomes. Healthcare institutions implemented statistical monitoring systems designed to flag when specific staff members are present during a disproportionate number of adverse events. Hospitals adopted stricter protocols for medication access, requiring multiple staff members to verify withdrawals of controlled substances and maintaining detailed logs that could be audited. These changes came too late for Jones's victims, but represented an acknowledgement that the healthcare system had failed to protect its most vulnerable patients. The case also highlighted the dangers of allowing employees to resign quietly rather than facing formal investigations. Bexar County Hospital's decision to let Jones walk away without reporting their suspicions to authorities or warning potential future employers allowed her to continue killing. The deaths at Dr. Holland's clinic might have been prevented if the hospital had fulfilled its responsibility to protect the public, even at the cost of potential legal liability. Jones continues to maintain her innocence in public statements, claiming she was a dedicated nurse who loved children and that the deaths were tragic but not criminal. She has given occasional interviews from prison where she portrays herself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and statistical manipulation. These claims ring hollow against the overwhelming evidence of her guilt and the pattern of deaths that followed her throughout her brief nursing career. She remains incarcerated in Texas, now 74 years old, serving a life sentence that ensures she will never again have access to vulnerable children. For the families of her confirmed and suspected victims, there is no real closure. Some parents spent decades believing their children died from natural causes or undiagnosed medical conditions, only to learn years later that their babies were likely murdered. Others have suspicions that can never be proven, left to wonder whether their grief might have been prevented if someone had acted sooner on the warning signs that surrounded Janine Jones from the very beginning. Case 3. Beverly Allett. The children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital should have been a place of healing. Parents brought their sick children there expecting professional care, trusting that nurses would protect their most vulnerable patients. Between February and April 1991, that trust was catastrophically misplaced. In just 59 days, 13 children on Ward 4 experienced sudden, unexplained medical emergencies. 4 of them died. 9 survived with injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic brain damage. At the center of every incident was a 23-year-old children's nurse named Beverly Allett. Allett had joined the nursing staff at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in early 1991, having completed her training despite a troubling record. Throughout her nursing education, she had been absent frequently, claiming various illnesses and injuries. She wore bandages regularly, reported mysterious ailments, and sought medical attention with unusual frequency. Her attendance record was poor enough that she nearly failed to complete her training, but she managed to graduate and secured a position at the hospital where she would soon begin attacking children under her care. From the beginning, Allett exhibited behaviors that should have raised concerns. She volunteered eagerly for extra shifts, particularly night duties when supervision was minimal. She showed excessive interest in the sickest children on the ward, requesting assignments to care for patients with the most serious conditions. Colleagues noticed she seemed unusually excited during medical emergencies, positioning herself at the center of crisis responses and appearing energized rather than distressed when children crashed. The attacks began on February 21, 1991. 7-week-old Liam Taylor was admitted to Ward 4 with a chest infection, a common childhood illness that typically resolves with routine treatment. Allett was assigned as his nurse. Within hours of admission, Liam suffered a cardiac arrest. Medical staff responded immediately, managing to resuscitate him, but his condition remained unstable. He experienced 2 more cardiac arrests over the following days, each time while Allett was caring for him. Doctors couldn't explain why a baby with a simple chest infection was experiencing repeated heart failures. Liam survived, but the mysterious emergencies left his parents terrified and confused. On March 5th, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted with epilepsy. He was a regular patient at the hospital, and his condition was well managed. Allett was assigned to his care. Shortly after she administered medication, Timothy went into cardiac arrest and died. The death was attributed to his epilepsy, though his parents questioned why their son, who had been stable for years, suddenly died during a routine admission. The attacks accelerated. On March 10th, 1-year-old Kaylee Desmond was brought to the ward with a chest infection. While under Allet's care, the child stopped breathing and turned blue. Allet called for emergency assistance, and doctors managed to revive Kaylee. She was transferred to a larger hospital for specialized care, where she recovered. Medical staff at Grantham couldn't identify what had caused the respiratory arrest. 4 days later, on March 14th, Paul Crampton, a 5-month-old with a chest infection, experienced a similar emergency. He stopped breathing while Allet was caring for him, turned blue, and required emergency resuscitation. He survived but suffered brain damage from oxygen deprivation. 2 days after that, Bradley Gibson, a 5-year-old with pneumonia, went into cardiac arrest under Allet's supervision. He was resuscitated but left with permanent disabilities. The pattern continued with horrifying consistency. Yik Hung Henry Chan, a 2-year-old recovering from a minor fall, was admitted for observation. On March 22nd, while in Allet's care, he suddenly collapsed. Doctors revived him, but he collapsed again hours later. He died on March 23rd. The cause of death was listed as natural, though medical staff couldn't identify what had caused a previously healthy child to experience sudden organ failure. 5-month-old Becky Phillips was admitted on April 1st with gastroenteritis. She was recovering well under standard treatment, but on April 5th, while Allet was on duty, Becky went into cardiac arrest. She was resuscitated and appeared stable. Her parents were relieved their daughter had survived the emergency, not knowing that the person who had nearly killed her would strike again. On April 17th, Becky was readmitted with a similar illness. Once again, she was assigned to Allet's care. Once again, she suffered a cardiac arrest. This time, she could not be saved. Becky died on April 22nd, and her parents were left devastated, unable to understand why their daughter had experienced 2 life-threatening emergencies from what should have been a manageable childhood illness. Katie Phillips, Becky's twin sister, was admitted as a precaution after her sister's death. The family wanted to ensure Katie wasn't suffering from the same mysterious condition that had killed Becky. Allet volunteered to care for Katie. On April 23rd, Katie experienced a sudden collapse and stopped breathing. Medical staff managed to resuscitate her and transferred her immediately to a specialized hospital in Nottingham, where she recovered. Doctors there noted unusual patterns in her medical charts that suggested her collapse hadn't been natural. The final victim was 15-month-old Claire Peck, who was admitted with asthma on April 22nd. She was stable and responding well to treatment. On April 23rd, while alone with Allet, Claire went into cardiac arrest. Doctors attempted resuscitation for over an hour, but couldn't save her. She died that evening, and her death was initially attributed to her asthma, though specialists later noted that her condition hadn't been severe enough to cause sudden death. By late April 1991, medical staff at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. Ward 4 had experienced an unprecedented cluster of cardiac arrests and unexplained deaths in just 2 months. Doctors reviewed the cases and noticed that nearly all the emergencies had occurred during Beverly Allet's shifts. When she wasn't working, the ward functioned normally. When she was on duty, children died, or nearly died, with alarming regularity. Hospital administrators contacted the police, and investigators began examining the cases. They discovered that Allet had been present for every single incident. They reviewed medical records and found inconsistencies in her documentation. In some cases, she had charted symptoms and deterioration that other staff members hadn't observed. She had been alone with victims immediately before they crashed. The statistical probability of so many emergencies occurring by chance during one nurse's shifts was essentially zero. Detectives arrested Allett on May 21, 1991. A search of her home revealed medical supplies she had taken from the hospital. Forensic investigators began examining the victims, and toxicology tests on those who had died revealed the methods Allett had used. In several cases, children had been injected with massive doses of insulin, causing severe hypoglycemia that triggered cardiac arrest. In other cases, air had been injected directly into their bloodstreams, creating emboli that blocked blood flow and caused heart attacks or strokes. Some children had suffered both types of attacks during repeated hospitalizations. The evidence painted a horrifying picture. Allett had systematically targeted children on her ward, injecting them with substances that caused medical emergencies. She would then insert herself into the emergency response, sometimes successfully helping to resuscitate children she had just poisoned. She documented the suffering she caused in detailed medical charts, recording symptoms and deterioration as if they were naturally occurring events rather than deliberate attacks. In cases where children survived initial attacks, she struck again during subsequent admissions, subjecting the same victims to repeated episodes of terror and suffering. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Allett suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a severe psychological disorder in which caregivers fabricate or induce illness in those under their care to gain attention and sympathy. Throughout her life, Allett had exhibited classic signs of the condition. She had repeatedly faked her own illnesses during her childhood and nursing training, seeking medical intervention for conditions she didn't have. As a nurse with access to vulnerable children, she transferred this pattern outward, creating medical crises in her patients to position herself as a dedicated caregiver, struggling heroically to save them. The trial began in February 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Allett's guilt, including forensic testimony about the insulin and air injections, statistical analysis showing the impossible clustering of emergencies during her shifts, and witness accounts of her behavior before and during the incidents. The defense argued that Allett was mentally ill and that her actions were driven by psychological compulsion rather than malicious intent. The jury convicted Allett on all counts: 4 murders, 3 attempted murders, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. The judge sentenced her to 13 concurrent life sentences, declaring that she posed an ongoing danger to children and should never be released. The court recommended she receive psychiatric treatment in a secure facility rather than a standard prison, acknowledging that her actions stemmed from severe mental illness. Allett was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Nottinghamshire, where she has remained ever since. She has been diagnosed with multiple disorders, including Munchausen syndrome, by proxy, personality disorders, and depression. Mental health professionals who have evaluated her over the decades have consistently concluded that she poses a permanent risk to others and particularly to children. She has never expressed genuine remorse for her crimes and has never provided full explanations for why she targeted specific children or why she attacked some victims multiple times. The impact on the victims' families has been immeasurable. Parents who trusted the hospital to care for their children discovered that a nurse had deliberately poisoned them. Some families had spent years believing their children died from natural causes or undiagnosed conditions, only to learn during the investigation that their babies had been murdered. Survivors like Paul Crampton and Bradley Gibson were left with permanent brain damage and disabilities, their lives fundamentally altered by injuries that should never have occurred. The case forced significant changes in how the UK healthcare system monitors unusual patient outcomes. Hospitals implemented protocols requiring immediate investigation when cardiac arrests or unexplained deaths cluster in specific wards or during particular staff members' shifts. The National Health Service developed statistical monitoring systems designed to detect patterns that might indicate a healthcare worker is harming patients. These changes aim to prevent another Beverly Allitt from operating undetected, particularly in pediatric settings where young victims cannot report what's being done to them. The tight time frame of Allitt's crimes, just 59 days from first attack to final victim, highlighted how quickly healthcare serial killers can accumulate victims when they have unrestricted access to vulnerable patients. If hospital administrators had acted sooner, if the pattern had been recognized after the first 3 or 4 incidents rather than after 13, multiple lives could have been saved. The speed with which Allitt escalated from her first attack to killing and harming children repeatedly demonstrated the urgent need for rapid response protocols when unusual patterns emerge. Medical psychology researchers have studied the Allitt case extensively as a clear example of Munchausen syndrome by proxy in a healthcare setting. Her history of fabricating her own illnesses during training, combined with her targeting of patients once she gained access to them, illustrated the progression of the disorder. The case became a teaching tool for identifying warning signs in medical professionals and for understanding the psychological motivations behind healthcare serial killers who create emergencies to satisfy their need for attention and validation. Allitt remains at Rampton Secure Hospital, now 56 years old. She has been the subject of parole reviews over the years, but mental health professionals and the parole board have consistently determined she should never be released. Her lack of insight into her crimes, her failure to demonstrate genuine remorse, and ongoing assessments that she would pose a risk to others have kept her confined. She will almost certainly spend the rest of her life in psychiatric detention. The children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital continued operating after Allitt's arrest, though the institution struggled with the stigma of having employed a serial killer. Parents in the area were understandably reluctant to bring their children to a hospital where such horrors had occurred. The case left a lasting mark on the small community of Grantham, where families knew the victims and where the betrayal of trust felt deeply personal. For the families of Timothy Hardwick, Henry Chan, Becky Phillips, and Claire Peck, there has been no way to reconcile their losses with the senseless nature of how their children died. They had entrusted their sons and daughters to a hospital and a nurse, believing they would be protected. Instead, they became victims of someone who saw them not as individual children with families who loved them, but as instruments through which she could generate drama and attention. The suffering Allitt inflicted, both on the children who died and those who survived with disabilities, stands as a reminder of what happens when psychological illness intersects with access to vulnerable victims, and when warning signs are not recognized quickly enough to stop the harm. Case 4. Kristen Gilbert. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton served men who had worn their country's uniform, who had deployed to distant conflicts, who had earned the right to expect care and protection in their later years. They came to the VA hospital trusting that the institution established specifically for veterans would honor their service with competent, compassionate treatment. Between 1995 and 1996, that trust was violated in the most disturbing way possible. A nurse named Kristen Gilbert was killing patients to create dramatic emergencies that would bring a security guard to her ward, a man she was desperate to impress as her marriage crumbled, and her obsession with him intensified. Gilbert began working at the VA Medical Center in 1989, shortly after completing her nursing degree. She was 23 years old, recently married, and presented herself as a dedicated professional eager to care for veterans. For the first several years of her employment, she functioned without incident, working in Ward C, a medical unit that treated veterans with cardiac conditions, respiratory issues, and other serious health problems. Colleagues found her competent, if somewhat intense, prone to emotional outbursts and interpersonal drama, but capable of providing adequate patient care. The situation changed in the mid-1990s when Gilbert's marriage began deteriorating. She started an affair with James Perot, a hospital security guard whose duties included responding to medical emergencies throughout the facility. Gilbert became fixated on Perot, pursuing him with increasing desperation even as he expressed ambivalence about their relationship. She needed his attention, craved his presence, and discovered that medical emergencies provided a guaranteed way to bring him to her ward. The method Gilbert chose was chillingly straightforward. She accessed epinephrine, a powerful medication used during cardiac emergencies, to stimulate heart contractions. In appropriate doses administered during actual cardiac arrest, epinephrine can be life-saving. In massive doses given to patients with functioning hearts, it causes fatal cardiac events, triggering irregular rhythms, heart attacks, and sudden death. Gilbert began injecting her patients with lethal amounts of epinephrine, then calling Code Blue to summon emergency response teams that included Perot. The pattern emerged quickly to those paying attention. During Gilbert's shifts, particularly in 1995 and 1996, the death rate on Ward C spiked dramatically. Patients who had been stable suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Veterans recovering from routine procedures experienced unexpected heart attacks. The frequency of Code Blue calls increased to levels far exceeding normal hospital statistics, and an unusual number of these patients died despite aggressive intervention. Colleagues began noticing Gilbert's behavior during these emergencies. Rather than appearing distressed or focused solely on the patient, she seemed energized and excited. She positioned herself prominently during resuscitation efforts, making sure Perot could see her working intensely to save the patient. She volunteered for extra shifts and seemed disappointed when emergency calls came during times she wasn't scheduled. Some nurses started tracking the pattern informally and realized that Code Blues occurred almost exclusively when Gilbert was on duty. The victims were men who had served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts. They ranged in age from their mid-30s to their 80s, representing different generations of American military service. Stanley Jagodowski, a 66-year-old Korean War veteran, died on June 23, 1995, after experiencing sudden cardiac arrest during Gilbert's shift. Henry Huden, a 35-year-old Gulf War veteran being treated for a relatively minor condition, went into cardiac arrest and died on January 21, 1996. Kenneth Cutting, an elderly World War II veteran, suffered a fatal heart attack on February 1, 1996, despite having been stable earlier that day. Edward Squira, an 80-year-old veteran, died on March 14, 1996, after a sudden and unexplained cardiac emergency. These were not men on the edge of death. While they had health problems that brought them to the VA hospital, they were not in immediate danger of dying. Their conditions were being managed, their prognoses were generally favorable, and their families expected them to recover and return home. Instead, they became victims of a nurse who saw them not as individuals who had served their country, but as instruments she could use to manufacture drama and capture the attention of a man she was obsessed with. Hospital staff finally began raising formal concerns in late 1995 and early 1996. 3 nurses approached administrators with their observations about the correlation between Gilbert's shifts and patient deaths. They presented data showing that Code Blues had increased dramatically since Gilbert joined Ward C and that the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Hospital officials launched an internal investigation reviewing patient records and medication logs. What investigators discovered was damning. During an 18-month period, 350 patients had died at the VA Medical Center. This was not unusual for a facility treating seriously ill veterans, but the distribution of deaths was highly unusual. A disproportionate number occurred during Gilbert's shifts. More specifically, Investigators found that the hospital pharmacy had dispensed massive amounts of epinephrine during the period in question, far exceeding what would be needed for legitimate medical purposes. Much of this epinephrine had been accessed during Gilbert's work hours. The VA contacted federal authorities, and the investigation expanded. The FBI became involved because the crimes occurred at a federal facility against veterans. Agents interviewed hospital staff, reviewed medical records, and analyzed statistical data. They discovered that during the 18-month period when Gilbert was most active, the death rate on Ward C was 40 to 50% higher than normal. When Gilbert worked, patients died. When she took vacation or called in sick, the death rate returned to baseline levels. Investigators exhumed the bodies of several suspected victims and performed toxicology tests. They found elevated levels of epinephrine in tissues, levels far exceeding what would be present naturally or from legitimate medical intervention. The evidence indicated that these men had been injected with massive doses of the drug shortly before their deaths. Medical examiners determined the deaths were homicides. Gilbert's behavior became increasingly erratic as the investigation progressed. She made threatening phone calls to colleagues who had reported their suspicions. She called in bomb threats to the hospital, apparently hoping to create chaos that would distract from the investigation or demonstrate that the facility had bigger problems than suspicions about her. The bomb threats were traced back to her, adding federal charges to the murder allegations. In October 1996, Gilbert was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Federal prosecutors also charged her with making bomb threats and obstructing justice. The trial, which began in late 2000, presented overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Prosecutors introduced statistical analysis showing the impossible correlation between her shifts and patient deaths. They presented testimony from nurses who had witnessed her suspicious behavior. They showed pharmacy records documenting excessive epinephrine usage during her work hours. They presented forensic evidence from exhumed bodies. James Perot testified for the prosecution, explaining that Gilbert had been obsessed with him and that she had made comments suggesting she was creating emergencies to get his attention. He described how she seemed to know in advance when code blues would be called, sometimes telling him he should stay nearby because he would be needed soon. His testimony painted a picture of a woman so consumed by romantic obsession that she was willing to kill patients to manufacture interactions with the object of her fixation. The defense argued that the deaths were natural, that Gilbert was being scapegoated for mortality that occurred in a ward treating seriously ill patients, and that the statistical evidence was being manipulated to create a false pattern. The defense suggested that Gilbert was a dedicated nurse who happened to work in a high-mortality unit, and that the prosecution was engaged in a witch hunt based on circumstantial evidence and coincidence. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching verdicts in March 2001. They convicted Gilbert of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The convictions related to 4 confirmed victims: Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Huden, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira. The jury acquitted her of first-degree murder in the death of Edward Squira, but convicted her of second-degree murder in that case, indicating they believed she had killed him, but that the prosecution hadn't proven premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. During the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Gilbert's crimes were particularly heinous because she had betrayed the trust of veterans and had killed multiple victims in a cold, calculated manner. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty question, unable to reach unanimous agreement. Under federal law, this meant Gilbert could not be sentenced to death. Instead, the judge sentenced her to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, ensuring she would die in prison. Gilbert's conviction brought some measure of justice for the confirmed victims, but investigators believe the actual death toll was much higher. Statistical analysis suggests that as many as 70 patients may have died at Gilbert's hands during her years at the VA Medical Center. Many of these cases cannot be prosecuted because bodies were cremated, medical records are incomplete, or too much time has passed to gather reliable forensic evidence. Families of veterans who died during the mid-1990s while under Gilbert's care have lived with uncertainty, suspecting but never confirming that their loved ones were murdered. The case exposed significant weaknesses in how the VA healthcare system monitored controlled substances and tracked unusual mortality patterns. The fact that Gilbert was able to access massive quantities of epinephrine without triggering immediate review revealed gaps in medication security protocols. The delay in recognizing the pattern of deaths during her shifts highlighted the need for better statistical monitoring systems that could detect and flag unusual correlations between specific staff members and adverse patient outcomes. Following Gilbert's conviction, the Department of Veterans Affairs implemented reforms designed to prevent similar crimes. Hospitals adopted computerized systems that track controlled substance usage and generate alerts when patterns deviate from norms. The VA developed protocols requiring immediate investigation when mortality rates spike in specific units or during particular employees' shifts. Healthcare facilities implemented peer review processes where staff can confidentially report concerns about colleagues without fear of retaliation. The psychological profile that emerged from Gilbert's case illustrated a different motivation than other healthcare serial killers. She wasn't driven by hero syndrome or mercy delusions. She wasn't seeking attention from grateful families or recognition as a talented caregiver. Her motivation was romantic obsession, the desperate need to maintain connection with a man who was pulling away from her. The patients existed only as tools she could use to create situations where she and Perot would be thrown together in high-stress environments. Their lives, their service to their country, their families waiting for them to recover, none of it mattered to her. The betrayal felt particularly acute because the victims were veterans who had earned specialized care through their military service. They had faced enemy fire, endured hardships in defense of their country, and come to the VA hospital expecting safety and respect. Instead, they encountered a predator who saw them as expendable props in her romantic obsession. The fact that she killed these men casually, choosing victims based on convenience rather than any assessment of their condition or prognosis, added to the senselessness of their deaths. Gilbert remains incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a facility that houses female federal inmates with medical and mental health needs. She is now 57 years old and has shown no remorse for her crimes. In occasional interviews and court filings, she has maintained her innocence, claiming she was wrongfully convicted based on circumstantial evidence and statistical manipulation. These assertions have been consistently rejected by courts reviewing her appeals. The families of her confirmed victims, the Jagodowski, Hudon, Cutting, and Squira families, attended trial proceedings and sentencing hearings, providing victim impact statements that describe the devastating loss of their loved ones and the violation of trust that came with learning they were murdered by someone entrusted with their care. Their statements emphasized that these were fathers, husbands, grandfathers, men who had survived wars and built lives, only to have those lives stolen by someone who valued her romantic drama more than their continued existence. For the broader veteran community, the Gilbert case represented a profound betrayal. The VA hospital system exists specifically to honor military service by providing quality health care to those who wore the uniform. When a nurse within that system chose to kill the very people the institution was designed to protect, it damaged trust in a way that extended far beyond the specific facility in Northampton. Veterans nationwide questioned whether they could trust VA hospitals, whether the people caring for them truly had their best interests at heart. The case continues to be studied in medical ethics courses and criminal justice programs as an example of how healthcare institutions must remain vigilant for warning signs of employee misconduct and how important it is to act quickly when patterns emerge suggesting a staff member may be harming patients. The correlation between Gilbert's shifts and patient deaths was so strong that it should have triggered immediate investigation, but institutional inertia, reluctance to believe a nurse could be a killer, and fear of false accusations allowed her to continue killing for months after concerns were first raised. Kristen Gilbert's crimes stand as a reminder that trust in healthcare settings must be balanced with robust monitoring systems, that statistical anomalies demand investigation rather than rationalization, and that the most vulnerable patients, those who cannot speak for themselves, those who trust completely in their caregivers, deserve protection through institutional vigilance. The veterans who died on Ward C at the VA Medical Center in Northampton served their country and earned better than to become victims of a nurse's twisted romantic obsession. Case 5. Niels Hugel. Germany's healthcare system is known for its efficiency, its rigorous standards, its commitment to patient safety. These qualities made what happened at 2 hospitals in northern Germany between 2000 and 2005 even more incomprehensible. A nurse named Niels Hugel was killing patients on a scale that defied belief, injecting them with drugs that caused cardiac arrest so he could demonstrate his resuscitation skills during the emergencies he created. When he was finally caught and convicted in 2008, authorities believed they understood the scope of his crimes: 6 murders over several years. The truth turned out to be exponentially worse. Hugel had killed at least 85 patients, and investigators believe the actual number may exceed 300, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in modern German history. Hugel began his nursing career in 1999 after completing his training. He was 22 years old, and his early work showed no obvious signs of the catastrophic harm he would soon inflict. In 2000, he secured a position in the intensive care unit at Oldenburg Hospital, one of the larger medical facilities in Lower Saxony. ICU work requires specialized skills and offers nurses significant autonomy, particularly during night shifts when physician supervision is limited. Hugel thrived in this environment, not because he provided exceptional patient care, but because the setting gave him unrestricted access to critically ill patients and the medications he would use to kill them. The pattern began almost immediately. Patients in Oldenburg's ICU experienced cardiac arrests at rates that exceeded normal statistical expectations. These weren't patients on the edge of death whose hearts simply gave out. Many were recovering well, their condition stabilizing, their prognoses favorable. Then, without warning, they would crash. Their hearts would stop or fall into chaotic rhythms that couldn't sustain life. Emergency response teams would rush to their bedsides, attempting resuscitation while trying to understand what had triggered the sudden deterioration. Hugel positioned himself at the center of these emergencies. He demonstrated competence during resuscitation efforts, sometimes successfully reviving patients whose hearts he had just stopped. Colleagues began noticing his pattern of being present during crashes, his eagerness to participate in emergency responses, his apparent skill at managing cardiac arrest situations. Some viewed him as a talented nurse who remained calm under pressure. Others found his enthusiasm during life-or-death situations unsettling, an excitement that felt inappropriate given the circumstances. The method Hugel used was devastating in its simplicity. He accessed medications used for cardiac patients, drugs like agmeline, lidocaine, and other antiarrhythmic agents, and administered them in doses or circumstances that induced rather than treated cardiac problems. He injected patients with substances that disrupted their heart rhythms, causing ventricular fibrillation, bradycardia, or complete cardiac arrest. The drugs were legitimate medications found in any ICU, making their presence unremarkable. What made them lethal was how Högl used them, on patients who didn't need them, in doses that were excessive, at times when no physician had ordered their administration. What made Högl's crimes particularly disturbing was his willingness to attack the same patient multiple times. If a patient survived his first attempt on their life, he sometimes tried again days later. These repeat attacks suggested that his primary motivation wasn't killing itself, but creating the drama of resuscitation. Successful revivals allowed him to experience the satisfaction of being seen as competent and skilled. Deaths provided the somber recognition that comes with fighting valiantly, but losing a patient despite best efforts. Either outcome fed his psychological needs. By 2002, mortality rates at Oldenburg Hospital's ICU had become impossible to ignore. Data showed that death rates during certain shifts far exceeded normal patterns, and those shifts corresponded with Högl's work schedule. Colleagues began raising concerns with supervisors, noting the correlation between his presence and patient crashes. Some staff members expressed these concerns directly to management, pointing out the statistical anomalies and requesting investigation. Hospital administrators at Oldenburg faced a decision that would haunt them for years. They could launch a formal investigation that might expose the institution to legal liability and reputation damage, or they could handle the situation quietly by removing Högl from his position. They chose the latter option. In 2002, rather than reporting Högl to authorities or conducting a thorough review of patient deaths during his employment, Oldenburg Hospital allowed him to resign. He left with a clean employment record, free to seek work at another healthcare facility. Högl found employment almost immediately at Delmenhorst Clinic, another hospital in Lower Saxony, approximately 50 kilometers from Oldenburg. Hospital officials at Delmenhorst had no indication that concerns had surrounded Högl's previous employment. They hired him to work in their intensive care unit, giving him the same access to vulnerable patients and life-saving medications that he had exploited at Oldenburg. The killing resumed immediately. Within months of starting at Delmenhorst Clinic, the ICU experienced a spike in cardiac emergencies and unexpected deaths. The pattern from Oldenburg repeated itself with horrifying consistency. Patients crashed during Högl's shifts at rates that couldn't be explained by the severity of their conditions. Emergency response teams found themselves called to the ICU with unusual frequency, particularly during night shifts when Högl worked. Colleagues at Delmenhorst began noticing the same troubling behaviors that had concerned staff at Oldenburg. Högl seemed energized during emergencies, eager to demonstrate his resuscitation techniques, unusually present whenever patients experienced sudden deterioration. The mortality statistics became so skewed that nurses started informally tracking them, comparing death rates during Högl's shifts with rates when other nurses worked. The correlation was undeniable. In 2005, the pattern finally triggered a response that went beyond quiet resignation. A colleague at Delmenhorst Clinic witnessed Högl injecting a patient with an unauthorized medication. The witness reported what she had seen immediately, and this time, hospital administrators contacted law enforcement rather than handling the situation internally. Police launched an investigation, and Högl was arrested. The initial investigation focused on recent cases at Delmenhorst Clinic where evidence could still be gathered. Investigators exhumed bodies of patients who had died during Högl's shifts and performed toxicology tests. They found elevated levels of medications that hadn't been prescribed, drugs that could only have been administered by someone with access to the ICU pharmacy. Högl was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder based on cases where physical evidence confirmed his actions. In 2008, Högl was convicted of 6 murders and 7 counts of attempted murder at Delmenhorst Clinic. The court sentenced him to 7.5 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the charges prosecutors had been able to prove at that time. The investigation appeared complete, the case closed. Hogel would serve his sentence, and the hospitals would implement reforms to prevent similar incidents. But families of patients who had died at both Oldenburg Hospital and Delmenhorst Clinic weren't satisfied. They pushed for expanded investigation, arguing that the 6 confirmed murders represented only a fraction of Hogel's actual victims. Journalists began examining mortality statistics from both hospitals, publishing reports that showed death rates had spiked dramatically during the years Hogel worked in their ICUS. The pressure mounted for authorities to take a comprehensive look at every patient death that occurred during his employment. In 2014, prosecutors reopened the investigation. They launched a massive review of patient records from both hospitals, examining hundreds of cases where patients had died during Hogel's shifts. They exhumed more than 130 bodies, performing toxicology tests to determine whether unauthorized medications had been administered before death. The scope of what they discovered was staggering. Evidence emerged suggesting that Hogel had killed patients on a scale that shocked even experienced investigators. The exhumations and medical record reviews indicated that dozens, possibly hundreds of patients had been murdered. Many victims had been cremated, making it impossible to gather physical evidence. In other cases, too much time had passed for toxicology tests to detect the substances Hogel had used. But the pattern was unmistakable. When Hogel worked, people died at rates that couldn't be explained by natural causes or the severity of their conditions. In 2018, Hogel was charged with 100 additional murders. The trial, which began in October 2018 and concluded in June 2019, examined 100 cases where evidence suggested Hogel had killed patients at Oldenburg Hospital and Delmenhorst Clinic. Prosecutors presented testimony from colleagues who had witnessed suspicious behavior, statistical analysis showing impossible mortality patterns during his shifts, and forensic evidence from exhumed victims. Hogel himself provided crucial testimony. Unlike many healthcare serial killers who maintain innocence, Hogel admitted to killing patients. He confirmed that he had administered unauthorized medications to induce cardiac arrest so he could attempt resuscitation. He described the satisfaction he felt when successfully reviving someone, the recognition he received from colleagues who viewed him as skilled during emergencies. He acknowledged that some patients couldn't be saved and that he sometimes tried again with the same patient if his first attempt hadn't resulted in cardiac arrest. The jury convicted Hogel of 85 murders. They acquitted him in 15 cases where evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, even though many believed he was responsible for those deaths as well. The court couldn't reach verdicts on several additional cases due to evidentiary limitations. In June 2019, the judge sentenced Hogel to life imprisonment with special severity, a designation under German law that means he will never be eligible for parole. He will die in prison. But even 85 confirmed murders doesn't capture the full scope of Hogel's crimes. Investigators believe the actual victim count is far higher. Statistical analysis suggests that as many as 300 patients may have died at his hands during his years at both hospitals. The vast majority of these cases cannot be prosecuted because bodies were cremated, medical records are incomplete, or forensic evidence has degraded beyond usefulness. An investigative commission established to identify all of Hogel's victims concluded that the true number will never be known with certainty. The investigation revealed catastrophic institutional failures at both hospitals. At Oldenburg Hospital, colleagues had reported concerns about mortality patterns during Hogel's shifts as early as 2002. Management dismissed these concerns, and when pressure mounted, they allowed Hogel to resign rather than investigating whether patients had been harmed. This decision enabled Hogel to continue killing at Delmenhorst Clinic, where he murdered dozens more patients before finally being caught. German authorities took the unprecedented step of filing criminal charges against hospital administrators who had failed to act on warnings about Hogel. Former managers at both Oldenburg Hospital and Delmenhorst Clinic were prosecuted for negligent homicide, charged with enabling murders through their failure to investigate suspicious mortality patterns and report concerns to authorities. Some administrators were convicted and received suspended sentences, a rare acknowledgment that institutional leaders bear responsibility when they ignore evidence that staff members are harming patients. The Hogel case forced Germany to examine how healthcare institutions monitor employee behavior and respond to concerns about patient safety. The federal government established new protocols requiring immediate investigation when mortality rates deviate significantly from statistical norms. Hospitals implemented computerized systems that track adverse events by individual staff members and automatically flag unusual patterns. Legislation was passed making it mandatory for healthcare facilities to report suspected patient harm to licensing authorities and law enforcement, even if evidence is incomplete. For the families of Hogel's victims, the revelations that emerged during the expanded investigation brought devastating confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered. Many families had spent years believing their relatives died from natural complications of their illnesses. Learning that their father, mother, spouse, or child had actually been killed by a nurse who saw them as instruments for practicing resuscitation techniques added layers of grief and anger to losses they had already processed. An additional tragedy was that many families could never receive definitive answers. Hogel claimed he couldn't remember all his victims, that the individual cases blurred together over the years. When families attended court hearings desperate to learn whether their loved one had been murdered, Hogel sometimes couldn't or wouldn't provide clear confirmation. The investigative commission worked to identify as many victims as possible, but for dozens of families there would be only suspicion rather than certainty. The psychological profile that emerged from Hogel's testimony and evaluation painted a picture of someone driven by ego and the need for validation. He wasn't killing out of mercy or malice towards specific individuals. He was creating opportunities to demonstrate competence during emergencies, to be seen as skilled and valuable by colleagues, to experience the rush of successfully resuscitating someone whose heart he had just stopped. The patients existed only as props in scenarios where he could perform and be recognized. Their lives, their families, their futures, none of it registered as meaningful to him. Hogel remains imprisoned in Germany, where he will spend the rest of his life. He is now 47 years old and has cooperated to some extent with efforts to identify his victims, though his memory remains conveniently selective. The investigative commission continues working to document every case where evidence suggests he was responsible, even if prosecution is no longer possible. This effort serves primarily to provide families with answers and to create a comprehensive historical record of what happened. The impact on the two hospitals involved has been profound. Both Oldenburg Hospital and Delmenhorst Clinic struggled with the stigma of having employed Germany's most prolific serial killer, with having failed to stop him despite warnings, with having protected their institutional interests over patient lives. The institutions implemented extensive reforms, replaced leadership, and worked to rebuild trust with the communities they serve. For the broader German healthcare system, the Hogel case represented a catastrophic failure of oversight and accountability. The fact that a nurse could kill potentially 300 patients across two hospitals over 5 years, that colleagues' concerns could be dismissed by management, that he could move from one facility to another with no warning about suspicions, exposed systemic weaknesses that demanded comprehensive reform. The case became a catalyst for change in how Germany monitors healthcare workers, investigates suspicious patterns, and holds institutions accountable for protecting patients. The victims of Niels Hogel, those 85 confirmed murders and the hundreds of suspected additional deaths, represent lives that should have been protected by the healthcare system. They were people recovering from illness, people whose families expected them to come home, people who trusted that the nurses caring for them had their best interests at heart. Instead, they encountered someone who valued his ego gratification more than their continued existence, and they died in institutions that failed to stop him despite clear warning signs. Their deaths, and the institutional failures that enabled those deaths, continue to shape how Germany and other nations approach the critical question of how to protect the most vulnerable from those entrusted with their care. Case 6, Orville Lynn Majors. Clinton, Indiana, is the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone, where families have lived for generations, where the local hospital serves as a cornerstone of community life. Vermilion County Hospital wasn't a large facility, just a modest rural hospital serving the medical needs of approximately 16,000 residents. When elderly residents needed intensive care, their families trusted that the hospital's ICU would provide competent, compassionate treatment. Between 1993 and 1995, that trust was catastrophically misplaced. A nurse named Orville Lynn Majors was systematically killing patients, and the death toll in a tiny rural ICU reached levels that seemed impossible until investigators examined the statistics and realized they were looking at one of the most prolific healthcare serial killers in American history. Majors began working at Vermilion County Hospital in the early 1990s as a licensed practical nurse. He was a local resident, known in the community, someone who had grown up in the area and chosen to work at the hospital that served his neighbors. He was assigned to the intensive care unit, working exclusively night shifts when physician oversight was minimal and nursing staff had significant autonomy in patient care. Colleagues found him competent, but noted his tendency to make dark comments about patients, particularly elderly ones with serious health problems. The deaths began accumulating almost immediately after Majors started working regular ICU shifts. Vermilion County Hospital typically recorded about 26 deaths per year across all departments, a reasonable number for a small rural facility treating a patient population with significant elderly representation. But between December 1993 and March 1997, the hospital recorded 147 deaths. This represented a death rate more than 5 times higher than normal, and the vast majority of these deaths occurred in the ICU during night shifts when Majors was on duty. The victims were elderly patients ranging in age from their mid-50s to late 80s, admitted to the ICU for conditions that required monitoring but weren't immediately life-threatening. Some were recovering from heart attacks or strokes. Others were being treated for pneumonia, diabetes complications, or other manageable conditions. These weren't patients circling the drain, expected to die within days, regardless of intervention. They were people whose families anticipated recovery, discharge, and return home. Instead, they experienced sudden cardiac arrests that couldn't be explained by their underlying conditions. Majors's method was chillingly efficient. He accessed potassium chloride and epinephrine, medications commonly found in ICU settings. Potassium chloride, when administered properly as a prescribed medication, helps regulate heart function. When injected rapidly in concentrated doses directly into an IV line, it causes the heart to stop. Epinephrine, used during cardiac emergencies to stimulate heart contractions, becomes lethal when given in massive doses to patients whose hearts are functioning normally. Majors injected his victims with these substances during night shifts, triggering fatal cardiac events that appeared on the surface to be natural deaths of elderly, sick patients. What distinguished the Majors case from other healthcare serial killers was the stark statistical evidence that eventually exposed him. The numbers were so extreme, so far outside normal parameters, that they couldn't be explained by chance, patient population changes, or severity of illness factors. When Majors worked, people died. When he didn't work, mortality rates returned to normal. The correlation was so strong that it would become the primary evidence used to convict him. Families of patients who died at Vermilion County Hospital began noticing patterns. They shared experiences at funerals, in church gatherings, at community events. Multiple families described similar circumstances. A relative admitted to the ICU with a manageable condition, stable initially, then sudden deterioration during the night, cardiac arrest, death before morning. The commonality of these stories prompted questions about why so many people were dying at the hospital, particularly in the ICU, particularly at night. Hospital staff noticed the pattern too. Nurses working alongside Majors observed that death rates during his shifts far exceeded what they experienced when working with other colleagues. Some began informally tracking the numbers, comparing mortality statistics by shift and by nurse. The results were disturbing. Majors' shifts produced death rates that were statistically impossible to explain through normal ICU mortality patterns. By late 1994, concerns had reached hospital administrators. They commissioned an internal review of ICU deaths, examining patient records and circumstances surrounding each case. The review confirmed what staff members had been observing. The death rate during Majors' shifts was extraordinarily high. In response, administrators removed Majors from direct patient care duties in March 1995, reassigning him to tasks that didn't involve hands-on clinical work. The impact was immediate and undeniable. After Majors was removed from patient care, the death rate at Vermilion County Hospital dropped by 79%. ICU mortality returned to levels consistent with the hospital's historical averages. The dramatic decrease provided powerful circumstantial evidence that something about Majors' presence had been causing the elevated death rate. Hospital officials contacted the Indiana State Police, and investigators launched a formal inquiry into suspicious deaths at the facility. Detectives began reviewing patient records from the period when Majors had worked in the ICU. They interviewed family members of deceased patients, asking about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. They spoke with hospital staff about their observations and concerns. They analyzed medication dispensing records, looking for patterns in how controlled substances were accessed and used. The evidence that emerged painted a damning picture. Medical examiners exhumed bodies of patients who had died during Majors' shifts and performed toxicology tests. In several cases, they found elevated levels of potassium chloride and epinephrine, levels that couldn't be explained by legitimate medical treatment. The substances had been injected shortly before death, in doses sufficient to cause fatal cardiac events. Experts testified that these levels could only have resulted from deliberate injection, not from natural physiological processes or appropriate medical intervention. The statistical evidence proved even more compelling than the forensic findings. Experts analyzed 3 years of mortality data from Vermilion County Hospital, comparing death rates across different shifts, different nurses, and different time periods. They calculated the probability that the clustering of deaths during Majors' shifts could have occurred by chance. The odds were astronomical against it being coincidental. When Majors worked, patients died at rates that were orders of magnitude higher than when other nurses worked. The pattern was so consistent and so extreme that it constituted powerful proof of criminal activity. Investigators identified at least 130 suspicious deaths that occurred during Majors' employment at Vermilion County Hospital. These were cases where elderly patients with manageable conditions died suddenly during night shifts when Majors was their nurse. Many of these victims had been expected to recover. Their families had been told their conditions were improving, that discharge planning was beginning, that they would soon go home. Instead, they experienced unexpected cardiac events that killed them before morning. In December 1997, Majors was arrested and charged with 6 counts of murder. Prosecutors focused on cases where physical evidence was strongest, where exhumations had revealed elevated drug levels, where medical records clearly documented that Majors had been the attending nurse, where family testimony and medical expert analysis could establish that the deaths were homicides rather than natural causes. The 6 cases represented murders prosecutors felt confident they could prove beyond reasonable doubt, though they believed Majors was responsible for far more deaths. The trial, which began in 1999, centered on the statistical evidence and expert testimony. Prosecutors presented data showing the extraordinary clustering of deaths during Majors' shifts. They brought in forensic pathologists who explained how the elevated drug levels found in victims could only have resulted from deliberate injection. They called family members who described their loved ones' conditions improving before sudden, unexplained deterioration during the night. They presented testimony from hospital staff who had witnessed Majors' suspicious behavior and his disturbing comments about elderly patients. Majors' defense argued that he was being scapegoated for natural deaths that occurred in an ICU treating seriously ill elderly patients. They contended that the statistical evidence was being manipulated, that elderly patients die in hospitals for many reasons, and that the prosecution was engaging in a witch hunt based on coincidence rather than proof. They suggested that the hospital was trying to blame a single nurse for systemic failures in patient care. The jury found the prosecution's case convincing. In October 1999, they convicted Majors on all 6 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 360 years in prison, 60 years for each murder conviction, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated with no possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and the court's determination that he posed a permanent danger if ever released. During the investigation and trial, some light was shed on Majors' possible motivations. Colleagues recalled him making comments suggesting he believed he was helping elderly patients find peace, that he was relieving their suffering, that their families would be grateful not to watch them decline slowly. These statements suggested a twisted mercy-killing rationale, though medical evidence showed his victims weren't suffering from terminal conditions or unbearable pain. They were patients with treatable illnesses who should have recovered. Other aspects of his personality raised concerns as well. Former colleagues described him as having a troubling attitude toward elderly patients, sometimes expressing frustration with demanding patients or suggesting that certain people weren't worth the resources required to keep them alive. These comments, dismissed at the time as dark humor or stress-related venting, took on sinister meaning after his arrest. The impact on Clinton and the surrounding Vermilion County community was devastating. This was a small town where victims were known personally to many residents. Families attended the same churches, shopped at the same stores, had children who went to school together. Learning that a trusted nurse had been systematically killing their neighbors, parents, and grandparents shattered the community's sense of safety. Funerals that had seemed to mark natural passings were recontextualized as murders. Grief was compounded by betrayal. Vermilion County Hospital struggled to survive the scandal. The facility's reputation was destroyed, and patients who needed ICU care increasingly chose to travel to hospitals in larger cities rather than risk admission to a facility where more than 100 people had been murdered. The hospital closed its ICU shortly after the investigation became public, unable to staff the unit or convince the community that adequate safeguards were in place. The facility eventually closed entirely in 2003, a casualty of the damage Majors' crimes had inflicted on its credibility. The case became a landmark example of how statistical analysis can detect healthcare serial killers. The 79% drop in mortality after Majors was removed from patient care provided one of the clearest demonstrations on record that a single individual had been causing deaths. This evidence, combined with forensic findings and witness testimony, established a framework for how similar cases could be investigated and prosecuted in the future. Healthcare institutions nationwide studied the Majors case as an example of the importance of monitoring mortality patterns by individual staff members. The dramatic statistical correlation between his work schedule and patient deaths illustrated that data analysis could reveal patterns that might not be immediately obvious to frontline staff. Hospitals implemented computerized systems to track adverse events by employee, creating alerts when patterns deviate from norms. The case also highlighted challenges in prosecuting healthcare serial killers. Even though investigators believed Majors killed 130 or more patients, prosecutors could only pursue charges in 6 cases where evidence met the beyond reasonable doubt standard. Many victims had been cremated, eliminating the possibility of forensic analysis. In other cases, too much time had passed for toxicology tests to detect the substances Majors used. Medical records from the early 1990s lacked the detail needed to reconstruct exactly what happened during patients' final hours. These evidentiary limitations meant that most of Majors's suspected victims would never receive justice through the criminal system. Families of the 120-plus suspected victims who weren't included in the criminal charges lived with uncertainty. They suspected their loved ones had been murdered, but couldn't prove it definitively. Some filed civil lawsuits against the hospital, arguing that the institution had been negligent in its hiring and supervision of Majors and had failed to act quickly enough when mortality patterns became apparent. Many of these cases settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. Majors maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, though he offered little in the way of alternative explanations for the overwhelming statistical evidence against him. He filed appeals challenging his conviction, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the statistical analysis was flawed. Courts consistently rejected these appeals, finding that the evidence had been more than sufficient to support the guilty verdicts. On September 24, 2017, approximately 18 years into his 360-year sentence, Orville Lynn Majors died in prison. He was 56 years old, and the official cause of death was listed as heart failure due to natural causes. The irony wasn't lost on observers. A man convicted of causing fatal cardiac events in his victims had himself died of a heart attack. His death came before he served even a fraction of his sentence, and before families of his suspected victims received answers about whether their loved ones had been among those he killed. The Majors case stands as one of the clearest examples of how data can expose healthcare serial killers who might otherwise operate undetected. The stark correlation between his work schedule and patient deaths, the 79% drop in mortality when he was removed from patient care, the statistical impossibility of the death clustering occurring by chance, these elements created an evidentiary record that was unusually strong for cases that often rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. For the families of his victims, confirmed and suspected, there remains the profound sense of betrayal that comes from learning that someone entrusted with caring for their loved ones had instead ended their lives. In a small community like Clinton, where trust runs deep and everyone knows everyone, that betrayal cut particularly deep. The elderly patients Majors killed were neighbors, friends, relatives of people he saw in daily life. They had trusted him because he was one of their own, someone from their community who they assumed shared their values and their commitment to caring for others. The closure of Vermilion County Hospital, the loss of local health care access, and the lasting trauma inflicted on families who lost loved ones represent the broader damage that healthcare serial killers inflict beyond their immediate victims. Majors didn't just take 130 lives. He destroyed a community's trust in its healthcare system, eliminated a critical local institution, and left hundreds of family members questioning whether deaths they had accepted as natural were actually murders they would never be able to prove. Case 7. Victorino Chua. Most healthcare serial killers leave behind a trail of dead patients and unanswered questions about their motivations. Victorino Chua left something different, a handwritten diary where he documented his crimes, referred to his actions as the game, and called himself the Bitter Nurse. The discovery of these writings provided investigators with a chilling window into the mind of someone who systematically poisoned patients at Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, England, between 2011 and 2012. He contaminated saline bags and medication ampules with insulin, causing severe hypoglycemic events that killed 2 patients and seriously injured dozens more. What made the case particularly disturbing was the calculated nature of his attacks and the fact that he kept score, tallying victims as if their suffering was nothing more than points in a game only he was playing. Chua was born in the Philippines and immigrated to the United Kingdom, where he completed his nursing training and obtained registration with the Nursing and Midwifery Council. By 2011, he was working as a staff nurse at Stepping Hill Hospital, a large National Health Service facility serving the Greater Manchester area. He worked in the acute medical wards, caring for elderly patients recovering from various illnesses and injuries. Colleagues found him competent, but noted he could be moody and withdrawn, sometimes expressing frustration with his work or with patients he found demanding. The attacks began in June 2011, though hospital staff didn't immediately recognize them as deliberate sabotage. Patients on the acute medical wards began experiencing unexpected hypoglycemic episodes, dangerous drops in blood sugar that caused confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness, and in severe cases, cardiac arrest. These episodes occurred in patients who weren't diabetic, who had no medical reason to experience sudden drops in blood sugar, and who hadn't been prescribed insulin. Medical staff were baffled by the pattern of unexplained hypoglycemia affecting multiple patients across different wards. The method Chua used was insidious and difficult to detect initially. Rather than directly injecting individual patients, he contaminated saline bags and ampules of medication with insulin. These contaminated supplies sat in storage areas or medication carts, waiting to be used by nurses during routine patient care. When unsuspecting staff members administered IV fluids or medications from the tainted supplies, they unknowingly poisoned their patients. This approach allowed Chua to attack multiple victims with a single act of sabotage and created confusion about how patients were being poisoned, since the nurses directly caring for victims weren't responsible for the contamination. By July 2011, the pattern of unexplained hypoglycemic events had become impossible to ignore. Hospital administrators recognized they were facing something unprecedented, a cluster of similar events affecting patients who shouldn't have been experiencing insulin-related complications. They contacted the police, and investigators from the Greater Manchester Police launched a criminal inquiry. The hospital implemented emergency protocols, checking all saline bags and medication supplies for tampering, restricting access to medication storage areas, and increasing supervision of patient care activities. Investigators discovered that numerous saline bags and ampules had been contaminated with insulin. Someone had accessed these supplies, used syringes to inject insulin through the rubber stoppers, and returned them to storage where they appeared unused and safe. The contaminated supplies were then administered to patients during routine care, causing the hypoglycemic emergencies that were overwhelming the hospital's medical staff. The investigation focused on identifying who had access to the contaminated supplies and who had been present during the time frame when the tampering must have occurred. Chua emerged as a person of interest. Investigators examined his work schedule and found correlations between his shifts and the appearance of contaminated supplies. They interviewed colleagues who reported that Chua had been observed in medication storage areas at unusual times and that he had been present on wards where multiple patients experienced unexplained hypoglycemic events. The breakthrough came when police executed a search warrant at Chua's home in January 2012. They discovered handwritten notes that Chua had composed, entries that read like diary excerpts or personal reflections. The content was chilling. Chua had written about his actions in cryptic but unmistakable terms, referring to himself as the bitter nurse and describing his attacks on patients as the game. He had documented his feelings about his work, his patients, and his crimes, creating a written record that would become the prosecution's most powerful evidence. In one passage, Chua wrote about the bitter nurse confession, acknowledging what he had done and expressing a mixture of remorse and defiance. In other sections, he referred to specific incidents using language that matched documented patient poisonings. He tallied numbers, apparently keeping track of how many people he had harmed. The writings revealed someone who was fully aware that his actions were wrong, but who continued anyway, treating the suffering he caused as if it were a game with winners, losers, and a scoreboard. The diary entries provided investigators with evidence that the poisonings were deliberate, that Chua was responsible, and that he had attacked patients systematically over an extended period. Combined with the physical evidence of contaminated supplies, the correlation between his work schedule and poisoning incidents, and testimony from colleagues who had witnessed suspicious behavior, the case against Chua was overwhelming. 2 of Chua's victims didn't survive their poisoning. Alfred Weaver, an 83-year-old patient recovering from a stroke, experienced severe hypoglycemia after being given contaminated saline. He suffered cardiac arrest and died on July 2, 2011. Tracy Arden, a 44-year-old woman being treated for depression, received insulin-contaminated fluids that caused catastrophic hypoglycemia. She died on July 5, 2011, after her organs failed from the physiological stress. Both victims had been recovering from their primary conditions and had reasonable expectations of survival before they were poisoned. 21 additional patients survived their poisoning, but suffered serious injuries. The severe hypoglycemic events caused seizures, brain damage, prolonged hospitalizations, and lasting health complications. Some survivors required extended rehabilitation. Others were left with permanent cognitive impairment or physical disabilities resulting from the poisonings. These were elderly patients, many already struggling with health problems, whose conditions were dramatically worsened by Chua's attacks. Chua was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 22 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm, and 1 count of poisoning. The trial began in 2015 at Manchester Crown Court. Prosecutors presented the diary entries, arguing they constituted a clear confession to deliberate poisoning. They showed the correlation between Chua's work schedule and the appearance of contaminated supplies. They presented testimony from medical experts explaining how the insulin contamination had caused patients' injuries and deaths. They called survivors and family members who described the devastating impact of the poisonings. The defense argued that the diary entries were ambiguous, that they represented creative writing or expressions of frustration rather than confessions to actual crimes. They contended that the correlation between Chua's shifts and the contamination incidents was circumstantial. They suggested that other hospital staff could have been responsible and that Chua was being scapegoated. The defense painted him as a dedicated nurse who was frustrated with working conditions, but who hadn't deliberately harmed patients. The jury didn't find the defense arguments persuasive. In May 2015, they convicted Chua of 2 counts of murder, 22 counts of attempting to cause grievous bodily harm, and 1 count of administering poison. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 35 years before he would be eligible for parole consideration. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of his crimes, the vulnerability of his victims, and the breach of trust inherent in a healthcare worker poisoning patients. The sentencing judge condemned Chua's actions in stark terms, noting that he had caused immense suffering to vulnerable patients and their families, that he had betrayed the nursing profession, and that his diary entries revealed a disturbing mindset that treated patient harm as entertainment. The judge emphasized that Chua had shown no genuine remorse and had persisted in maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The impact on Stepping Hill Hospital was significant. The institution faced intense scrutiny over how Chua had been able to access and contaminate medical supplies without detection. The poisoning incident prompted a comprehensive review of medication security protocols, access controls to supply storage areas, and supervision of staff activities. The hospital implemented new systems requiring multiple staff members to verify the integrity of medication supplies before use and installed additional security measures to prevent tampering. For the families of victims, the trial provided some answers but couldn't undo the harm inflicted. The relatives of Alfred Weaver and Tracy Arden learned that their loved ones had been murdered by someone who was supposed to be caring for them. Survivors and their families struggled to process the trauma of learning they had been deliberately poisoned, that their medical crises hadn't been unavoidable complications, but rather the result of criminal sabotage by a nurse who saw them as pawns in a game. The diary entries that convicted Chua continue to disturb investigators and mental health professionals who have reviewed them. The language Chua used, referring to his crimes as the game, keeping a tally of victims, calling himself the bitter nurse, suggested someone who had disconnected emotionally from the suffering he caused. The entries revealed a capacity for compartmentalization, where he could function as a nurse providing routine care while simultaneously poisoning the same patients he was supposed to be helping. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during the investigation and trial provided limited insight into Chua's motivations. Experts found no evidence of severe mental illness that would explain his actions or diminish his culpability. He understood that poisoning patients was wrong, yet he did it anyway. The bitter nurse label he gave himself suggested resentment, perhaps toward his work, his patients, or his circumstances, but this didn't constitute a clear motive for why he chose to harm people under his care. The case prompted changes in how the National Health Service monitors and responds to unusual patterns of patient complications. Hospitals implemented systems to track unexpected medical events by type, location, and staff present during incidents. The protocols required immediate investigation when clusters of similar events occur, particularly when they involve unexplained medication-related complications. These reforms aim to detect sabotage more quickly, potentially stopping perpetrators before they can accumulate numerous victims. The Chua case also highlighted the challenge of detecting tampering with medical supplies. Unlike cases where nurses directly inject patients, sabotage of supplies in storage areas can be difficult to trace to a specific individual. The contaminated saline bags and ampules Chua prepared sat in medication rooms and carts, potentially touched by multiple staff members, before being used on patients. This made the investigation more complex and underscored the importance of security measures like surveillance in medication storage areas and tamper-evident packaging for supplies. Chua remains imprisoned in the United Kingdom, currently 59 years old. His earliest possible release date is 2050, when he would be 85 years old. Given his lack of remorse, his continued denial of responsibility despite overwhelming evidence, and the calculated nature of his crimes, it seems unlikely that parole will be granted even if he lives to see that date. Mental health professionals who have evaluated him consistently conclude that he poses an ongoing risk and that his psychological profile suggests a fundamental lack of empathy for his victims. The victims of Victorino Chua, the 2 who died and the 21 who survived with injuries, were elderly patients and middle-aged individuals being treated for various medical conditions at a hospital they trusted. Alfred Weaver had survived a stroke and was working toward recovery. Tracy Arden was being treated for depression and had her whole life ahead of her. The survivors included elderly patients in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who were already medically fragile and whose health was permanently damaged by the poisoning they endured. For the community served by Stepping Hill Hospital, the case damaged trust in an institution that had been a cornerstone of local health care for decades. Patients questioned whether they could safely receive treatment at a facility where a nurse had systematically poisoned people. The hospital worked to rebuild confidence through transparency about the reforms implemented and through continued cooperation with authorities investigating whether Chua might have been responsible for additional incidents beyond those charged. The diary Chua kept, with its references to the game and its tallying of victims, stands as one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in any healthcare serial killer case. Most perpetrators destroy evidence or maintain careful silence about their crimes. Chua documented his, creating a written record that revealed the cold detachment with which he approached harming patients. The fact that he framed his crimes as a game, complete with scorekeeping, illustrated a psychological disconnect that allowed him to poison vulnerable people while viewing their suffering as something abstract rather than real human tragedy. The Bitter Nurse Confession, as he called it in his writings, provided a title for his own criminal legacy, an acknowledgement of his guilt, even as he later attempted to maintain innocence in court. The contradiction between his written admission and his trial defense highlighted the cognitive dissonance often present in healthcare serial killers who know what they've done but cannot fully accept responsibility for it. Victorino Chua's crimes represent a betrayal of the nursing profession and of the vulnerable patients who depend on healthcare workers to protect rather than harm them. His systematic contamination of medical supplies, his documentation of his crimes as if they were a game, and his targeting of elderly and medically fragile patients illustrated the capacity for cruelty that can emerge when someone with access to vulnerable people chooses to abuse that access. The reforms that followed his conviction aim to prevent such abuse, but they also serve as a reminder that vigilance, rapid response to suspicious patterns, and accountability for those who harm patients remain essential to maintaining safety in healthcare settings. Case 8. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey called himself an angel of death. He claimed he was relieving suffering, providing mercy to patients who were ready to die, ending lives out of compassion rather than malice. Over 18 years working as a nurse's aide and orderly across multiple hospitals and care facilities in Ohio and Kentucky, Harvey confessed to killing 87 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But the mercy justification he offered didn't align with the facts. Many of his victims weren't terminal. Some were children. Others were recovering well and expected to go home. Harvey killed using an evolving arsenal of methods: arsenic, cyanide, suffocation, disconnecting ventilators, injecting hepatitis, and other pathogens. His victims died because he decided they should, not because death was imminent or suffering unbearable. In 2017, Harvey himself died violently, beaten to death in his prison cell by a fellow inmate, an ironic end for someone who had taken so many lives while claiming to be an angel of mercy. Harvey began his career in healthcare in 1970 at the age of 18, working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. He had no formal medical training beyond basic on-the-job instruction, but his position gave him access to patients, particularly those who were seriously ill or elderly. Within months of starting work, he committed his first murder. The victim was a stroke patient who Harvey later claimed was suffering. He suffocated the man with a plastic bag, then removed it and left the body to be discovered. The death was attributed to natural causes related to the stroke, and no investigation occurred. This initial success, if it can be called that, established a pattern Harvey would follow for nearly 2 decades. He would identify patients he deemed appropriate targets, kill them using methods that could plausibly appear natural or accidental, and rely on the fact that deaths in hospitals and nursing homes are common enough that not everyone triggers suspicion. For elderly or critically ill patients, death certificates could list underlying conditions as causes without anyone questioning whether the timing or circumstances warranted closer examination. Harvey's methods evolved and diversified over the years. In his early period at Marymount Hospital, he primarily used suffocation, placing plastic bags over patients' heads or smothering them with pillows. These methods required physical presence and left minimal evidence. Later, as he moved to other facilities and gained more knowledge about medications and toxic substances, his approach became more sophisticated and varied. At Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, where Harvey worked from 1975 to 1985, he expanded his repertoire considerably. He began using poisons, acquiring arsenic and cyanide that he administered to patients through various means. He mixed arsenic into patients' food or beverages, causing symptoms that mimicked natural illness, gastrointestinal distress, organ failure, cardiac events. Cyanide worked more quickly, causing rapid death that could be mistaken for sudden cardiac arrest or stroke in patients with pre-existing conditions. Harvey also employed mechanical methods. He disconnected patients from ventilators, causing death by oxygen deprivation. He manipulated medical equipment to create fatal complications. He injected patients with substances that would cause infections or organ damage. In some cases, he deliberately infected patients with hepatitis or introduced bacteria that would cause sepsis. The variety of methods made it difficult for anyone to recognize a pattern. Deaths at Drake Memorial occurred through many different apparent mechanisms, reducing the likelihood that investigators would connect them as the work of a single perpetrator. The victims spanned a wide demographic range. While many were elderly patients with serious illnesses, others were younger individuals who happened to be hospitalized when Harvey decided they should die. Some were cognitively impaired or comatose, unable to communicate or resist. Others were conscious and recovering, unaware that someone had decided to end their lives. Harvey later claimed that he could sense when someone was ready to die, that he had an intuitive understanding of which patients were suffering beyond hope of recovery. This justification fell apart under scrutiny. Multiple victims were not terminal, and medical records showed they had been expected to survive and potentially recover. One particularly disturbing aspect of Harvey's crimes was his willingness to kill people he knew personally. In 1983, he murdered his neighbor and former roommate, Carl Hoveler, by feeding him arsenic-laced pie over a period of weeks. Hoveler, 44 years old, was not a patient in Harvey's care, but someone he had personal conflicts with regarding money and living arrangements. This murder, distinct from the hospital killings, revealed that Harvey's motivations extended beyond any misguided mercy rationale to include more prosaic motives like financial gain and revenge. Harvey continued killing at an extraordinary rate throughout the 1980s. At Drake Memorial Hospital alone, investigators later estimated he may have killed 15 to 20 patients per year during his employment there. The hospital's mortality rate during his tenure was higher than statistical norms would predict, but the elevation wasn't dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm. Patients at Drake Memorial were seriously ill. Deaths were expected. The incremental increase caused by Harvey's murders blended into the background of natural hospital mortality. The pattern finally caught attention in 1987 when John Powell, a 44-year-old patient recovering from a motorcycle accident, died unexpectedly at Drake Memorial Hospital. Powell had been improving and was expected to be discharged soon. His sudden death from what appeared to be cardiac arrest surprised medical staff and devastated his family. An autopsy was performed, and toxicology tests revealed the presence of cyanide. This finding was impossible to explain through natural causes or accidental exposure. Someone had deliberately poisoned Powell. Hospital administrators contacted police, and investigators began examining recent deaths at Drake Memorial. They interviewed staff and quickly focused on Donald Harvey, who had been working in the area where Powell died, and who had access to the deceased patient. When questioned, Harvey initially denied involvement, but as evidence mounted, his resistance crumbled. He began confessing not just to Powell's murder, but to dozens of others spanning nearly 2 decades. Harvey's confessions were extensive and detailed. He admitted to killing patients at multiple facilities where he had worked. He described the various methods he had used, the poisons, the suffocations, the equipment manipulation, the deliberate infections. He provided names of victims, dates when possible, and explanations for why he had chosen particular individuals. His confessions ultimately encompassed 87 murders, though investigators believed some claims might be exaggerations and that the actual number was likely between 57 and 87 confirmed deaths. The motivations Harvey described were inconsistent and often contradictory. He claimed many victims were suffering and that he had ended their pain out of compassion. But when pressed about specific cases, he acknowledged that some patients hadn't been in severe pain, that some were expected to recover, that some weren't terminal at all. He admitted that in some cases he had killed patients who annoyed him, who were demanding or difficult, who represented inconveniences during his shifts. The angel of death persona he cultivated didn't match the reality of someone who killed for multiple reasons, only some of which had any connection to patients' suffering. Harvey was charged with multiple counts of murder in Ohio and Kentucky. Facing potential death sentences, he negotiated plea agreements with prosecutors in both states. In August 1987, he pleaded guilty to 24 counts of murder in Ohio and 13 counts in Kentucky. The plea deals spared him the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation and guilty pleas. In Ohio, he received 3 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. In Kentucky, he received 1 life sentence. The combined sentences ensured he would never be released from prison. The sentencing hearings brought families of victims face to face with the man who had killed their loved ones. They heard Harvey's confessions, his explanations, his claims about mercy and suffering. Many families were hearing for the first time that their relative's death hadn't been natural, that years after grieving and moving forward, they were learning their father, mother, spouse, or child had been murdered. The reopening of grief, combined with anger at the betrayal of trust, created emotional trauma that extended far beyond the original losses. The institutions where Harvey worked faced intense scrutiny. Drake Memorial Hospital, in particular, struggled with the revelation that one of its employees had murdered dozens of patients over a decade without being detected. The hospital implemented reforms, but the damage to its reputation proved insurmountable. Drake Memorial closed in 1990, unable to recover from the stigma of having employed one of America's most prolific serial killers. The case raised troubling questions about how Harvey had moved between facilities without his history following him. When concerns arose about his performance or when patterns of patient deaths were noticed, Harvey would resign or be quietly dismissed. He would then secure employment at another healthcare facility, with previous employers providing neutral references or simply confirming dates of employment. This pattern of passing problematic employees from one institution to another, rather than reporting concerns to licensing authorities or law enforcement, enabled Harvey to continue killing across multiple facilities over 18 years. Harvey served 30 years in prison following his convictions. During his incarceration, he gave occasional interviews where he discussed his crimes, his motivations, and his mindset during the years he was killing. He expressed some remorse, but also maintained that many of his victims had been suffering, and that he had genuinely believed he was helping them. Mental health professionals who evaluated him found no severe psychiatric illness that would explain his behavior. He understood that murder was wrong, yet he had done it repeatedly over nearly 2 decades. On March 30th, 2017, Donald Harvey was found severely beaten in his cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio. He had been attacked by fellow inmate James Elliott, who had beaten him with a homemade weapon. Harvey suffered massive head trauma and was transported to a hospital, where he died 2 days later, on March 31st, 2017, at the age of 64. Elliott, who was serving a life sentence for aggravated murder, was charged with Harvey's murder, but maintained that the attack had been in response to Harvey making inappropriate sexual advances. The circumstances of Harvey's death sparked discussions about prison safety and about whether his murder represented a form of vigilante justice. Some victims' families expressed satisfaction that Harvey had died violently, viewing it as karmic justice for someone who had caused so much death. Others found no comfort in it, noting that Harvey's death didn't bring back their loved ones or provide any additional closure beyond what his convictions had already offered. The irony of Harvey's death wasn't lost on observers. He had killed 87 people over 18 years, claiming to be an angel of mercy, ending suffering. He died at the hands of another convicted murderer in a violent attack that left him with the kind of suffering he claimed to have been sparing others from. The angel of death met a brutal end, killed by someone who saw him not as a mercy giver, but as a target deserving of violence. Harvey's case remains one of the most studied examples of healthcare serial killers motivated by claimed mercy. Mental health professionals and criminologists have examined his psychological profile extensively, trying to understand how someone could kill so many people while genuinely believing, at least partially, that they were acting compassionately. The consensus is that Harvey's mercy rationale was a post hoc justification he constructed to make his actions seem noble rather than criminal, a narrative that allowed him to continue killing without confronting the reality that he was committing murder. The variety of methods Harvey used over his career also drew attention. Unlike many healthcare serial killers who stick to 1 or 2 methods, Harvey employed at least a dozen different killing techniques. This versatility suggested someone who was adaptable, experimental, and willing to use whatever means were available to accomplish his goals. It also made detection more difficult, as deaths from suffocation, poisoning, equipment tampering, and infection appeared to have different causes rather than representing a pattern. The case influenced how healthcare institutions monitor employee behavior and investigate suspicious patterns. Harvey's ability to work at multiple facilities over 18 years, accumulating dozens of victims before being caught, demonstrated catastrophic failures in oversight. The reforms that followed his conviction included requirements for background checks that examined employment history across multiple institutions, mandatory reporting of suspicions about employee conduct to licensing authorities, and enhanced statistical monitoring of patient outcomes by individual staff members. For the families of Harvey's 87 confessed victims, or the 57 to 87 that investigators confirmed, the case brought delayed and incomplete justice. Many families had believed their loved ones died from natural causes and had processed their grief accordingly. Learning years or decades later that their relative had been murdered required them to reframe their loss, to confront anger and betrayal they hadn't known they should feel, to question why the healthcare system had failed to protect their family member. Some of Harvey's victims had been children, a particularly disturbing aspect of his crimes. While most of his targets were elderly or seriously ill adults, he also killed pediatric patients who happened to be under his care. The justification of mercy becomes even more hollow when the victims are children who hadn't lived full lives, who had futures that were stolen from them by someone who decided they weren't worth saving. The fact that Harvey was never executed despite confessing to 87 murders sparked debate about the death penalty and plea agreements. By pleading guilty and avoiding trial, Harvey escaped capital punishment in both Ohio and Kentucky, states that maintained death penalty statutes. Prosecutors accepted the plea deals because they guaranteed convictions and life imprisonment without the risk and expense of trials. But some victims' families felt that life in prison wasn't sufficient punishment for someone who had killed so many people. Harvey's death in prison at age 64 meant he served only 30 years of his life sentences. Given that he had killed over an 18-year period, this meant he spent less time imprisoned than he had spent murdering people. The calculus felt wrong to many observers. 87 lives taken, 30 years served. The math of justice couldn't balance, because no amount of prison time could truly account for the magnitude of his crimes. The legacy of Donald Harvey extends beyond his victim count to encompass what his case revealed about vulnerabilities in healthcare systems. He was able to kill for 18 years because institutions were slow to recognize patterns, reluctant to investigate suspicions, and willing to quietly dismiss problematic employees rather than reporting them. He was able to move between facilities because background checks were inadequate and because previous employers prioritized avoiding liability over protecting future patients. He was able to use multiple methods because medication security was lax and because deaths in healthcare settings weren't routinely scrutinized for signs of foul play. The reforms that emerged from his case, enhanced monitoring, better background checks, mandatory reporting, statistical tracking of outcomes, represented acknowledgments that systems had failed catastrophically. These changes came too late for Harvey's victims, but aimed to prevent future healthcare workers from accumulating similar body counts before being stopped. Whether these reforms have been sufficient, whether they've been implemented consistently across all healthcare facilities, whether they've been maintained as institutional memories of Harvey's crimes have faded, these remain ongoing questions. Donald Harvey died as he had lived, through violence. The man who claimed to be an angel of mercy, who said he ended suffering out of compassion, who positioned himself as someone performing difficult but necessary acts, died in a prison attack that exemplified the brutal reality of taking human life. There was no mercy in how he died, just as there had been no real mercy in how his victims died. Victims who ranged from children to the elderly, who included people recovering and expected to survive, who had families waiting for them to come home, and who deserved to live rather than becoming statistics in one man's decades-long killing spree. Case 9. Daniela Poggiali. Most healthcare serial killers attempt to hide their crimes, maintaining a professional facade while secretly harming patients. Daniela Poggiali did something different. She photographed herself with dying patients, posed smiling next to their bodies, sent the images to colleagues via WhatsApp, and made jokes about giving elderly patients the ultimate mercy. Her brazen documentation of what investigators believed were murders provided shocking evidence of cruelty and disrespect toward vulnerable people in her care. Yet, despite the disturbing photographs, despite the extraordinary death rate during her shifts, despite testimony from colleagues about her comments regarding helping patients die, the legal case against Poggiali proved more complicated than anyone anticipated. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, then had her conviction overturned on appeal. Years later, the case remains unresolved, highlighting the difficulty of prosecuting healthcare serial killers when evidence is primarily circumstantial. Poggiali worked as a nurse at Lugo Hospital in Ravenna, a facility in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. She was assigned to the geriatric ward, caring for elderly patients suffering from terminal illnesses, chronic conditions, and the general decline associated with advanced age. The work was demanding and emotionally difficult, involving patients who were often confused, in pain, or approaching the end of their lives. Most nurses approach this work with compassion and dignity. Poggiali developed a reputation for something quite different, a dark sense of humor that colleagues found increasingly disturbing. She worked night shifts, when supervision was minimal and when families were typically absent, having gone home to rest after long days, sitting vigil with elderly relatives. During these quiet hours, Poggiali had significant autonomy over patient care. She administered medications, monitored conditions, responded to emergencies, and documented outcomes. She also, according to evidence that later emerged, began killing patients she deemed ready for death. The method investigators believed she used was straightforward and difficult to detect. She administered large doses of potassium chloride, a substance that, when injected rapidly in concentrated form, causes cardiac arrest. For elderly patients with multiple health problems, heart attacks were not unusual occurrences. Death certificates would list cardiac arrest as the immediate cause of death, with underlying conditions as contributing factors. Without specific reason to suspect foul play, families accepted these deaths as natural, tragic, but inevitable outcomes for people at the end of their lives. Between 2012 and 2014, the death rate on Poggiali's ward rose dramatically. Patients died during her shifts at rates that far exceeded statistical norms for similar geriatric facilities. Some colleagues began noticing the pattern, discussing among themselves the unusual number of deaths occurring during her overnight duties. But in a geriatric ward where patients are seriously ill, death is expected. The line between an unfortunate clustering of natural deaths and something more sinister wasn't immediately clear. What ultimately drew attention to Poggiali wasn't statistical analysis, but her own behavior. She took photographs of herself with patients who were dying or recently deceased. In some images, she posed next to patients in their beds, smiling for the camera while they were in distress or unresponsive. In one particularly disturbing photograph that would later circulate widely in media coverage, she posed with her thumb raised next to an elderly woman who appeared to be dying or dead. Poggiali sent these photographs to colleagues via WhatsApp, accompanying them with messages that joked about her work and her patients. She made comments suggesting she was helping patients by ending their suffering, that she was providing the ultimate mercy to people who were ready to die. Some colleagues were shocked by the photographs and the messages, finding them disrespectful and disturbing. Others seemed to respond with dark humor of their own, though it's unclear whether they understood that Poggiali might actually be killing patients rather than simply making inappropriate jokes about natural deaths. In April 2014, family members of Rosa Calderoni, a 78-year-old patient who had died suddenly during the night, requested an autopsy. They had been told their mother died of natural causes, but something about the circumstances troubled them. The autopsy revealed extraordinarily high levels of potassium chloride in her system, levels that couldn't be explained by natural physiological processes or prescribed medications. The pathologist concluded that potassium chloride had been injected shortly before death, causing fatal cardiac arrest. This finding triggered a criminal investigation. Police reviewed records of other deaths at Lugo Hospital's geriatric ward and found a striking pattern. Mortality rates during Poggiali's shifts were far higher than during shifts when other nurses worked. Investigators interviewed colleagues who described Poggiali's disturbing sense of humor, her comments about helping patients die, and her practice of photographing herself with dying patients. When police examined Poggiali's phone, they found the selfies with patients and the WhatsApp messages joking about death and mercy killing. Investigators exhumed bodies of patients who had died during Poggiali's shifts and performed toxicology tests. In some cases, they found elevated levels of potassium chloride. In other cases, too much time had passed for tests to detect the substance reliably. The passage of time and the advanced age of victims, many of whom were cremated shortly after death, limited the number of cases where physical evidence could confirm poisoning. Poggiali was arrested in April 2014 and charged with murder. The investigation ultimately focused on 38 suspicious deaths that occurred during her employment at Lugo Hospital. Prosecutors believed she had systematically killed elderly patients she viewed as ready to die, administering lethal injections of potassium chloride, and then posing for photographs with victims as if their deaths were amusing rather than tragic. The trial began in 2015. Prosecutors presented the autopsy findings showing elevated potassium chloride levels in Rosa Calderoni and other victims. They showed the disturbing selfies that demonstrated Poggiali's callous attitude toward dying patients. They presented statistical analysis showing the impossible correlation between her shifts and patient deaths. They called colleagues who testified about her comments regarding helping patients die and providing mercy. They argued that the evidence, taken together, proved beyond doubt that Poggiali had murdered patients under her care. The defense challenged nearly every element of the prosecution's case. They argued that potassium chloride is naturally present in the body and that elevated levels could result from decomposition processes rather than injection. They contended that the selfies, while distasteful, didn't prove murder, that they represented poor judgment and dark humor rather than evidence of killing. They pointed out that the geriatric ward treated extremely sick elderly patients and that high mortality rates weren't necessarily suspicious. They suggested that Poggiali was being prosecuted for having a dark sense of humor and for working a shift where, by chance, many patients happened to die. In December 2016, the jury convicted Poggiali of murdering Rosa Calderoni. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty under Italian law. The verdict brought relief to families who believed their relatives had been murdered and validation for colleagues who had reported concerns about her behavior. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the legal proceedings were far from over. Poggiali's defense team appealed the conviction, arguing that the evidence was insufficient to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. They focused particularly on challenging the forensic evidence regarding potassium chloride levels, bringing in experts who testified that the tests were unreliable and that elevated potassium could result from natural post-mortem processes. They argued that the prosecution had relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence, the photographs, the statistics, the colleague testimony, without providing definitive proof that Poggiali had actually injected patients with lethal substances. In October 2019, an appeals court overturned Poggiali's conviction. The court ruled that while the circumstantial evidence was concerning, it didn't meet the high standard required for criminal conviction under Italian law. The judges noted that the forensic evidence regarding potassium chloride levels was disputed by experts and that alternative explanations existed for the findings. They determined that the selfies and inappropriate comments, while deeply troubling, didn't constitute proof of murder. The statistical correlation between her shifts and deaths, while suspicious, wasn't sufficient on its own to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Poggiali was released from prison in 2019 after spending 5 years in custody. The release shocked families of suspected victims and raised questions about how the justice system handles cases where strong circumstantial evidence exists, but physical proof is limited. Prosecutors announced they would seek a retrial, arguing that new evidence had emerged that could support murder charges. The retrial process has proceeded slowly through Italy's complex judicial system. Additional autopsies have been performed on exhumed victims. New forensic analyses have been conducted. Investigators have continued reviewing medical records and interviewing witnesses. As of the current date, the case remains active, with Poggiali neither fully exonerated nor definitively convicted. She lives under restrictions while the legal proceedings continue, unable to work as a nurse, but not imprisoned. The case has sparked intense debate in Italy about several issues. First, it highlighted the difficulty of prosecuting healthcare serial killers when evidence is primarily circumstantial. Medical murders can be designed to mimic natural deaths, particularly in elderly patients with multiple health problems. Detecting the difference between natural cardiac arrest and induced cardiac arrest requires forensic evidence that may not be available, especially if suspicions arise only after bodies have been buried or cremated. Second, the Poggiali case raised questions about how the legal system should weigh different types of evidence. The photographs of her posing with dying patients, while horrifying, didn't prove she killed them. The WhatsApp messages about mercy could be interpreted as dark jokes rather than confessions. The statistical correlation between her shifts and deaths was strong but not absolute proof of murder. When these circumstantial elements are combined, do they create a picture of guilt that meets the beyond reasonable doubt standard, or do they remain insufficient without direct physical evidence? Third, the case prompted discussions about euthanasia and end-of-life care in Italy. Poggiali's comments about providing mercy and helping patients die touched on sensitive questions about whether some healthcare workers might take it upon themselves to hasten death for patients they believe are suffering. Italy, like many countries, prohibits euthanasia and assisted suicide. The Poggiali case illustrated how seriously ill elderly patients might be vulnerable to healthcare workers who decide, without legal authority or patient consent, that death would be merciful. For the families of suspected victims, the overturned conviction and ongoing legal uncertainty has been agonizing. Many believe their relatives were murdered but cannot obtain definitive justice. They have attended multiple court proceedings, hoped for resolution, and instead encountered a legal system that struggles to reach final conclusions. Some families have pursued civil litigation, but without criminal convictions, these cases face their own challenges. The selfies that Poggiali took remain among the most disturbing evidence in any healthcare serial killer case. The images show a fundamental lack of respect for human dignity, a callousness toward dying people that violates every principle of nursing ethics. Even if, as her defense argued, the photographs don't prove murder, they demonstrate behavior that is profoundly inappropriate for a healthcare professional. The fact that she shared these images with colleagues, apparently seeking some form of validation or entertainment from them, suggests a workplace culture that had become desensitized to suffering. Colleagues who received the WhatsApp messages and photographs faced their own reckoning. Some testified that they had been disturbed by what Poggiali sent, but hadn't reported it to administrators. Others claimed they hadn't taken the images seriously, viewing them as tasteless jokes rather than evidence of actual harm. The case raised questions about professional responsibility. When nurses witness colleagues behaving inappropriately with patients, what obligation do they have to report those concerns, even if they're not certain whether actual harm is occurring? Lugo Hospital implemented reforms following the investigation. The facility enhanced supervision on night shifts, implemented more rigorous medication tracking systems, and developed protocols for investigating unusual mortality patterns. Hospital officials also addressed workplace culture issues, emphasizing that jokes about patient deaths or dying are unacceptable, regardless of how stressful the work environment becomes. The Italian healthcare system more broadly examined its practices for monitoring patient outcomes and investigating suspicious patterns. Professional nursing organizations condemned Poggiali's behavior and emphasized that photographing patients, particularly dying or deceased patients, for personal amusement violates fundamental ethical principles. The case became a teaching example in nursing ethics courses about maintaining respect and dignity for patients in all circumstances. Daniela Poggiali remains a controversial figure in Italy. To prosecutors and families of suspected victims, she is a serial killer who murdered vulnerable elderly patients and escaped full justice due to legal technicalities and forensic limitations. To her defense team and some legal analysts, she is someone convicted based on circumstantial evidence that didn't meet the proper standard of proof, someone whose poor judgment in taking inappropriate photographs was confused with actual criminal conduct. The truth likely lies in a place that the legal system has struggled to reach definitively. The statistical evidence suggests strongly that patients were dying at unusual rates during her shifts. The forensic evidence, while disputed, indicated elevated potassium chloride levels in some victims. The selfies and messages demonstrated a disturbing attitude toward dying patients. The colleague testimony about her comments regarding mercy killing suggested she may have seen herself as authorized to end lives. These elements, taken together, paint a troubling picture that many believe amounts to proof of serial murder. Yet the Italian courts, applying rigorous legal standards for proof beyond reasonable doubt, determined that the evidence, at least as presented in the initial trial, was insufficient for conviction. Whether the retrial will reach a different conclusion remains to be seen. The case may ultimately end without final resolution, another healthcare serial killer case where strong suspicions exist, but definitive legal conclusions remain elusive. For the 38 families whose elderly relatives died during Poggiali's shifts, and particularly for the family of Rosa Calderoni, whose autopsy first revealed the elevated potassium levels, the uncertainty is painful. They want to know definitively whether their loved ones were murdered. They want justice if crimes were committed. They want, at minimum, acknowledgement that their relatives deserve to die with dignity rather than becoming subjects of macabre selfies and WhatsApp jokes. The Poggiali case stands as a reminder that healthcare serial killer cases often involve more legal complexity than the straightforward narrative of crime, investigation, trial, and conviction. Forensic evidence in medical settings can be ambiguous. Statistical correlations, while powerful, may not satisfy legal standards of proof. Circumstantial evidence that seems compelling when combined may still leave reasonable doubt. And even when convictions are obtained, appeals courts may overturn them if they determine that evidence didn't meet required standards. These legal realities mean that some healthcare workers suspected of killing patients may never face definitive justice, leaving families without closure and communities without certainty about what happened in their hospitals and who was responsible. Case 10. Rita Mays. They had survived World War II and Korea. They had faced enemy fire, endured hardships in defense of their country, returned home to build lives and families. In their final years, when age and illness brought them to the Lewis A. Johnson FEF, a medical center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, they came to a facility established specifically to honor their service with quality care. Between 2017 and 2018, 7 of these elderly veterans were murdered while they slept, killed not by enemy combatants on distant battlefields, but by a nursing assistant named Rita Mays, who injected them with insulin as they lay helpless in their hospital beds. The men ranged in age from 81 to 96. They had earned the right to live out their final days with dignity and peace. Instead, they became victims of someone who claimed she couldn't explain why she killed them, offering no motive, no justification, no coherent reason for why she chose to end the lives of men who had served their country and deserved its protection. Rita Mays had worked at the Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center for more than a decade when she began killing patients in 2017. She was 45 years old, a nursing assistant assigned to overnight shifts on Ward 3A, a unit that treated elderly veterans with serious medical conditions. Her job responsibilities included monitoring patients, assisting with basic care needs, and alerting licensed nurses or physicians when patients' conditions changed. She had access to patient rooms, to medical equipment, and to the vulnerable men who slept through the night, trusting that the staff caring for them had their best interests at heart. The victims were among the oldest patients in the facility. Robert Lee Cosell Sr., 89 years old, had served during World War II. Archie D. Edgell, 84, was a Korean War veteran. George Nelson Shaw Sr., 81, had also served in Korea. Raymond Golden Jr., 88, Felix Kirk McDermott, 82, and Robert Edge Sr., 82, all belonged to the generation that had faced the challenges of mid-20th century global conflicts and returned to contribute to their communities for decades afterward. Russell Robert Posey Sr., 92, was among the oldest, a man who had witnessed nearly a century of American history, and who had every right to expect that his final days would be treated with the respect his service had earned. The method Mays used was insidious in its simplicity and cruelty. She accessed insulin, a medication used to treat diabetes, and injected it into patients who were not diabetic and had no medical reason to receive the drug. Insulin lowers blood sugar levels. In diabetic patients receiving appropriate doses, it helps manage their condition. In non-diabetic patients, particularly elderly ones in fragile health, it causes hypoglycemia, dangerous drops in blood sugar that lead to confusion, loss of consciousness, seizures, cardiac events, and death. Mays conducted her attacks during overnight hours when the veterans were asleep, when families had gone home, when the hospital was quiet, and supervision was minimal. She would enter their rooms, inject insulin into their IV lines or directly into their bodies, and then leave. The veterans would experience hypoglycemic crises in their sleep, their bodies unable to maintain function as blood sugar crashed. Some never regained consciousness. Others woke in medical distress, confused and deteriorating, their conditions spiraling toward death before medical staff could identify the cause or intervene effectively. The deaths initially appeared to be natural occurrences. Elderly patients with multiple health problems die in VA hospitals regularly. When an 89-year-old man with heart disease and other conditions passes away during the night, the assumption is typically that his underlying illnesses finally overwhelmed his body's ability to sustain life. Death certificates would list cardiac arrest or organ failure as immediate causes, with chronic conditions as contributing factors. Families grieved, but they accepted these deaths as the inevitable conclusion of long lives marked by declining health. But family members began asking questions. Some relatives thought their loved ones had been improving, that they had been stable, or even planning for discharge. The sudden deterioration and death seemed inconsistent with what they had been told about their father's or grandfather's conditions. A few families specifically questioned whether something had gone wrong, whether their veterans had received proper care, whether the deaths could have been prevented. In 2018, hospital officials at the VA Medical Center received enough concerning inquiries from families that they launched an internal review of recent deaths on Ward 3A. What they discovered was alarming. The review identified a cluster of unexplained deaths among non-diabetic patients who had experienced severe hypoglycemic events shortly before dying. All the deaths had occurred during overnight shifts. All had occurred on the same ward. The pattern was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Hospital officials contacted the VA Office of Inspector General and federal law enforcement. The investigation expanded, with agents reviewing patient records, medication logs, and staff schedules. They identified Rita Mays as a common factor in all the suspicious deaths. She had been on duty during the overnight hours when each veteran experienced the hypoglycemic crisis that led to death. She had access to insulin. She had been in the facility's medication room at times that corresponded with when insulin would need to have been accessed to cause the deaths. Investigators interviewed Mays in 2018. Initially, she denied any wrongdoing, claiming she had simply been doing her job as a nursing assistant and that the deaths were tragic but natural. But as evidence mounted and investigators pressed her with specific details about her access to insulin, her presence during the deaths, and the impossibility of the pattern being coincidental, her story began to collapse. In July 2020, Mays was arrested and charged with 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. The murder charges related to the 7 veterans who had died: Felix Kirk McDermott, George Nelson Shaw Sr., Robert Edge Sr., Raymond Golden Jr., Archie D. Edgell, Robert Lee Causel Sr., and Russell Robert Posey Sr. The assault charge related to an 8th victim who survived the insulin injection but suffered serious injury. Rather than proceed to trial, Mays negotiated a plea agreement. In July 2020, she pleaded guilty to all charges. During her plea hearing, she admitted that she had intentionally administered insulin to patients who were not prescribed the medication, knowing that it would harm them. When asked to explain her motivations, she offered no coherent answer. She stated that she couldn't explain why she had done it, that she had no clear motive, that she simply had committed the acts. This absence of explanation made the crimes even more disturbing for families. They wanted to understand why their loved ones had been targeted, what had motivated someone to kill elderly veterans who were defenseless in their hospital beds. Was it some twisted mercy-killing rationale? Was it frustration with demanding patients? Was it a psychological compulsion? Mays provided no answers, leaving families to grapple with the senselessness of their losses. In May 2021, a federal judge sentenced Mays to 7 consecutive life sentences for the murders and an additional 20 years for the assault. The consecutive nature of the sentences ensured that Mays would spend the rest of her life in federal prison with no possibility of parole or early release. The judge condemned her actions as a profound betrayal of trust, noting that the veterans she killed had served their country and deserved protection, not murder, from those entrusted with their care. During the sentencing hearing, family members of the victims provided impact statements describing the devastating effects of Mays's crimes. They spoke about their fathers and grandfathers, men who had served in World War II and Korea, who had survived combat and built families, who had lived into their 80s and 90s expecting to die naturally when their time came. Instead, they had been murdered by someone who was supposed to be caring for them. The cruelty of this betrayal, the violation of the trust that veterans place in the VA healthcare system, and the senselessness of deaths that served no purpose and benefited no one created grief that was compounded by anger and incomprehension. The case prompted a comprehensive review of the Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center's practices and policies. Federal investigators examined medication security protocols and discovered significant gaps. Insulin and other medications were not adequately secured or tracked. Nursing assistants, who should not have had unsupervised access to medications like insulin, were able to obtain and administer drugs without proper oversight. The monitoring systems that should have flagged unusual patterns of medication access or patient complications had failed to detect Mays's activities until multiple veterans were already dead. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced sweeping reforms at the Clarksburg facility and similar reviews at VA medical centers nationwide. New protocols were implemented requiring stricter control of medication access with computerized tracking systems that monitor who accesses which drugs and when. Nursing assistants and other support staff were restricted from accessing medications that should only be handled by licensed nurses or physicians. Enhanced supervision protocols were established for overnight shifts when fewer staff members are present and when patients are most vulnerable. The case also prompted federal legislation aimed at improving oversight of VA medical facilities. Congressional hearings examined how Mays had been able to kill 7 veterans over more than a year before being detected. Lawmakers questioned why warning signs weren't caught earlier, why family members' concerns about unexpected deaths hadn't triggered immediate investigation, and what systemic failures had allowed a nursing assistant to access and administer insulin without authorization repeatedly. The betrayal felt particularly acute within the veteran community. The VA healthcare system exists specifically because the nation recognizes an obligation to care for those who served in uniform. Veterans who fought in World War II and Korea had earned specialized health care through their service. They came to VA facilities expecting that the government they had defended would protect them in return. Instead, they encountered someone who violated that sacred trust in the most fundamental way, killing them as they slept. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who examined the case. These men had survived the beaches of Normandy, the frozen mountains of Korea, combat zones where enemy soldiers actively tried to kill them. They had dodged bullets, survived artillery barrages, endured conditions that killed many of their comrades. They had returned home, lived full lives, grown old. In their final years, when they should have been safe in a facility designed to honor their service, they were murdered by someone who faced no consequences for her actions until after 7 of them were dead. Mays offered no explanation that provided insight into her psychological state or motivations. She underwent mental health evaluations, but no diagnosis emerged that explained her behavior. She wasn't suffering from severe mental illness that impaired her understanding of right and wrong. She wasn't motivated by mercy, as her victims weren't terminally ill or in unbearable pain. They were elderly men with health problems, but not immediate threats to their lives. She wasn't seeking attention or trying to play the hero by creating emergencies. She simply administered fatal injections to sleeping veterans and couldn't or wouldn't explain why. This absence of motive frustrated investigators, victims' families, and the courts. Most criminal acts have understandable motivations, even when those motivations are twisted or morally repugnant. People kill for money, revenge, jealousy, power, or psychological compulsions that mental health professionals can identify and explain. Mays appeared to kill for no reason anyone could discern, making her crimes seem even more senseless and her victims' deaths even more meaningless. The surviving victim, who was assaulted with intent to commit murder but didn't die, faced his own trauma. He learned that someone had deliberately poisoned him, that he had survived only by chance or the resilience of his body despite Mays's attempt to kill him. The knowledge that he had been targeted, that his life had been threatened by someone he trusted, created psychological scars that accompanied whatever physical damage the insulin injection had caused. The case highlighted ongoing concerns about VA healthcare quality and patient safety. While most VA facilities provide excellent care and most VA employees are dedicated professionals, high-profile failures like the Mays case damage trust across the entire system. Veterans nationwide questioned whether they could safely receive treatment at VA hospitals, whether the people caring for them could be trusted, whether adequate safeguards existed to protect patients from staff members who might harm them. Rita Mays remains incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, the same facility that houses Kristen Gilbert, another nurse who murdered patients at a VA hospital. Mays is now 50 years old and will spend the rest of her life in federal prison. She has shown no signs of remorse, has provided no additional explanations for her crimes, and has not assisted investigators in determining whether there might be additional victims beyond the 7 confirmed murders and 1 assault. Investigators continue examining deaths that occurred at the Louis A. Johnson VA Medical Center during Mays's employment, trying to determine whether she might have killed more veterans than those for which she was charged. The difficulty in detecting insulin poisoning in elderly patients who died and were buried or cremated before suspicions arose means that other victims may exist but cannot be confirmed. Families of veterans who died at the facility during 2017 and 2018 have lived with uncertainty, wondering whether their loved ones were among Mays's victims, but unable to prove it definitively. For the families of Felix Kirk McDermott, George Nelson Shaw Sr., Robert Edge Sr., Raymond Golden Jr., Archie D. Edgell, Robert Lee Kozul Sr., and Russell Robert Posey Sr., The loss extends beyond individual grief to encompass a broader sense of betrayal. Their fathers and grandfathers had served their country, had earned the nation's gratitude and protection, had lived long lives marked by contributions to their communities and families. They deserved to die naturally, surrounded by loved ones, treated with the dignity their service had earned. Instead, they were murdered by someone who was supposed to be caring for them, killed for no reason anyone can understand, their final moments marked by the physiological crisis of insulin poisoning rather than the peaceful passing they had earned. The case stands as one of the most recent and clear-cut healthcare serial killer prosecutions in the United States. Unlike many similar cases that end in evidentiary challenges, prosecutorial decisions not to pursue charges, or convictions that are later overturned, the Mays case reached a definitive conclusion. She pleaded guilty, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and will never be released. Justice was served, even if it came too late for 7 veterans who died and one who survived a murder attempt. The reforms implemented at VA facilities nationwide in response to the Mays case represent an acknowledgement that systems had failed to protect vulnerable patients. The enhanced medication security protocols, the computerized tracking systems, the restrictions on who can access certain drugs, the increased supervision during overnight shifts, these changes aim to prevent another Rita Mays from harming patients under the guise of providing care. Whether these reforms will be sufficient, whether they will be implemented consistently across all VA facilities, whether they will be maintained over time as memories of the Clarksburg murders fade, these questions remain unanswered. What is certain is that 7 veterans who had served their country, who had earned its gratitude and protection, who should have been safe in a facility established to honor their service, were instead murdered by someone who violated every principle of healthcare ethics and every obligation society owes to those who have defended it. Their deaths represent a profound failure of individual character, of institutional safeguards, of the systems designed to protect the vulnerable, and of the promise that veterans who sacrifice for their country will be cared for when they need help in return. These 10 nurses transformed hospitals, places of healing, into hunting grounds. They targeted those who trusted them most, the elderly losing their strength, children fighting for their lives, veterans who survived wars only to face a different kind of enemy. The cases span continents and decades, yet the pattern remains disturbingly consistent. Warning signs dismissed, death clusters rationalized, and institutions protecting their reputations over their patients. While reforms have emerged from these tragedies, the question lingers: how many went undetected? The victims' memories demand we remain vigilant, that we listen when families raise concerns, and that we never allow efficiency or reputation to silence those speaking for the voiceless. Which of these cases shocked you the most? And do you think healthcare systems have done enough to prevent this from happening again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that changed our world.